Take a deep, gentle breath in and let it go slowly. Feel the weight of the day begin to soften. Notice how your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclenches, your brow smooths. You are safe here, listening to the quiet rhythm of my voice. There's no rush, nothing to solve, no duty calling you away. All you have to do is listen and drift. Imagine a soft velvet curtain falling between you and the rest of the world. It hushes the noise of the day, muting it into a distant, harmless hum. Now picture a gentle breeze brushing your cheek, a cool London breeze carrying the scent of damp cobblestones after a rain. Hear the faint patter of raindrops on wooden shutters. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolls the 9th hour, its echo rolling slowly across the River Thames. Your breathing becomes as slow as the bell's distant sway. In and out, each exhale sinks you deeper into your pillow, as though you are lying in a warm, candlelit chamber, wrapped in woolen blankets against the autumn chill. Tonight, I'll tell you a story to cradle you into stillness. It is a tale of rain and ink and a secret hidden between folds of parchment. A story whispered in the hush of Elizabethan London, when spies walked the shadowed lanes, and the glow of a single candle held more power than a sword. Our story tonight begins on a rain-soaked London evening. The year is 1586. A raw mist hangs above the Thames, drifting through narrow alleys paved with slick cobblestones. Along the river wharves, bargemen call to each other in muffled tones, their voices swallowed by the damp night air. A pale moon hides behind ragged clouds. Lanterns swing on iron hooks, casting small, trembling halos of light onto doorways of timber-bird houses. Up on Seething Lane, behind a heavy oak door, with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, a single candle glows inside a study chamber. Here sits Sir Francis Walsingham, Queen Elizabeth's trusted spymaster. His hair is streaked with silver, his beard neatly trimmed, his brow furrowed in thought. Before him lies a sheet of fine parchment, still blank under the warm flicker of the candle. The rain taps gently at the leaded glass window beside him, its droplets sliding down in winding paths like tiny silver rivers. Outside, the wind hums low against the shutters, a steady, soothing drone that fills the chamber with a feeling of secrecy. Walsingham dips a long quill into a small porcelain dish. Not ordinary ink, but a pale, watery fluid squeezed from lemons, nearly invisible on the page, unless coaxed by the warmth of a flame. He pauses, listening. From beyond the chamber door comes the soft creak of the wooden stair. Footsteps ascend, then halt. A knock, 3 times, deliberate and slow. "Enter," Walsingham murmurs, his voice calm as velvet. The door opens to reveal Thomas Phillips, a young cipher clerk whose clever mind has broken many coded letters. His cloak is damp from the drizzle. He carries a satchel of sealed messages tied in string. "My lord," Philippe says in a whisper. "Another dispatch from the northern border, and one from France." Walsingham gestures for him to set them near the hearth. The clerk obeys, then glances at the parchment on the desk. He knows better than to ask questions about the lemon ink letter forming there. The spymaster dips the quill again, its tip scratching faintly against the paper, a slow, almost melodic rhythm that joins the patter of the rain. Outside, in the courtyard below, a horse stamps its hoof impatiently as a groom adjusts its bridle. The sound drifts upward, muffled yet distinct in the mist. Walsingham begins to write, "For Her Majesty's eyes alone." The words are invisible to the candle's light, but he knows each stroke will reveal itself in amber glow when needed. At that moment, another figure appears in the doorway, Lady Blanche Parry, an aging gentlewoman of the Queen's household, trusted for her discretion. She carries a small brass lantern, whose glass is fogged with rain. "Sir Francis," she murmurs, "Her Majesty grows restless this night." She walks the long gallery alone, pacing by the painted maps. She awaits word of the traitors. Walsingham lifts his gaze to her lined, weary face. His expression softens. Soon, he replies quietly, "The words I send her tonight may guard her throne, or shake it." The candle sputters slightly, casting wavering shadows on shelves lined with leather-bound books. A single log in the hearth shifts with a gentle crackle, sending up the sweet scent of burning oak. For a moment, The three of them, the spy master, the clerk, the lady-in-waiting, stand silently listening to the symphony of the rain, the fire, and the distant river. In that hush, it feels as if the whole city is holding its breath. Outside the chamber, the corridor lay in hushed darkness as tall windows rattled gently in their leaded frames under the October wind. Thomas Phillips moved to the door and drew the bolt with a muted click, sealing them within the warm, candlelit study. "Best no one disturbs us," he whispered, and the spy master only nodded, his eyes still fixed on the faint strokes of his quill. Far across the city, beyond the river's curl, Whitehall Palace loomed with towers and chimneys rising like dark silhouettes against the low clouds. In one of its long galleries, Queen Elizabeth I herself paced slowly, her silk skirts brushing the polished oak floor, while her fingers toyed with a small golden locket that hung at her throat, as though it were a talisman for courage. Beside her walked Sir Christopher Hatton, the loyal courtier who watched her face, concerned by the restless flicker in her eyes. "Your Majesty," he murmured softly, "the night is unkind. You have walked these halls since dusk. Come rest a while by the hearth." Elizabeth paused by a tall, arched window. Beyond the glass she could see the Thames, black as ink under the moonless sky. A lantern on a passing barge glimmered briefly, then vanished into the fog. "I cannot rest," she replied in a quiet voice. "There are whispers of plots in the north, and I have yet to hear from Sir Francis." Her tone softened, almost as if speaking to herself. "They say even the rain carries secrets to those who listen." A log in the great hall's hearth cracked loudly, sending up a brief shower of sparks that drifted upward into the chimney's dark throat, while the faint scent of charred oak and damp wool filled the air. Meanwhile, back on Seething Lane, Walsingham sealed the letter. The parchment was folded carefully, then pressed with a warm silver seal bearing the royal cipher. The lemon ink words would remain hidden, seen only by the Queen beneath a candle's heat. He turned to Philippe and said, "You will carry this to the palace, but not by the main road. Take the river path and keep to the shadows near the warehouses. The city still sleeps uneasy from last week's arrests." Philippe inclined his head, pulling his damp cloak tighter around his shoulders as he tucked the letter safely into a leather wallet beneath his doublet. Lady Blanche Perry watched in silence, her lantern casting a circle of soft gold on the timbered floor. Feeling the weight of many secrets pressing upon this single slim sheet of parchment, the clerk departed quietly, boots thudding gently on the stair, the door closing behind him with a muted thump. Walsingham moved to the window and stood for a long moment, staring into the mist where the city's roofs were blurred like ghostly islands. His thoughts wandered to names he had read in intercepted letters, names of men who plotted in secret, rooms with candle stubs and whispered oaths. The rain softened to a fine drizzle, the steady drip from the eaves forming tiny pools that mirrored the swaying lanterns of the watchmen patrolling below. Farther down the lane, in a modest tavern called the Swan's Rest, two strangers sat in a corner booth beneath a smoky lantern. One wore a broad-brimmed hat pulled low, the other a patched woolen coat that smelled faintly of wet straw. They spoke in low French accents, their hands cupped around pewter mugs to keep warm, and between them lay a small scrap of parchment damp at the edges from spilled ale. A boy of perhaps 12 serving as tavern lad brought them another jug of cider and pretended not to notice their furtive glances at the door, though he lingered near enough to hear one of them mutter the name Babington. By the riverside stables, Philippe fastened his cloak's clasp and prepared his horse. The Queen stood silently for a moment, her thumb tracing the edge of the parchment, as though feeling the weight of each hidden word. The flame on the nearest candle bent slightly in the draught that crept beneath the gallery doors. Hatton noticed the distant look in her eyes and dared not speak further, understanding that in her heart the monarch and the woman were at war. Walsingham, still at Seething Lane, knelt by a large oak chest, sorting through a pile of intercepted letters tied with fraying ribbons. Each bore the marks of secrecy. Wax seals cracked, edges singed where they had been carefully warmed to reveal the hidden ink within. He murmured softly to himself, so many voices in these pages, voices that would undo a crown. Behind him, the dying fire gave off a last, gentle crackle, then sank to glowing embers that glowed like watchful eyes in the darkened hearth. Outside his window, the rain ceased at last, leaving the city steeped in a glistening hush. The streets reflected the lanterns of late-night watchmen who shuffled by in pairs, their halberds resting on their shoulders as they muttered about the cold. A distant church bell tolled softly, counting the hours till dawn. By the riverside warehouse, the two French-speaking strangers finished their cider and rose to leave the tavern. Their footsteps splashed through puddles as they slipped into the shadowed alleys near the docks. The boy from the tavern, curious and emboldened, trailed after them a few paces, careful to keep to the shadows. He watched as one of the men unfurled the damp scrap of parchment under the glow of a street torch, the letters smeared but still legible. He could not understand their words, but caught the unmistakable sign of a cipher. At Whitehall, Queen Elizabeth dismissed her attendants with a soft wave of her hand. She stepped closer to the great window beside the hearth, watching a wisp of mist curl along the Thames, silvered faintly by a pale glimmer of moonlight breaking through the clouds. For a fleeting moment, her posture softened, shoulders drooping beneath the weight of rule. In that fragile pause, she looked less like a queen and more like a solitary figure, listening to the night breathe against the palace walls. Lady Blanche returned to her side, carrying a goblet of warmed wine, scented faintly with cloves. "Majesty," she whispered, "there is solace in small comforts, even if only for a breath." Elizabeth accepted it, holding the cup in both hands to draw warmth into her fingers. In a chamber below, Philippe conferred with a palace guard about the arrival of another courier. The guard mentioned a rider who had come earlier with news from York, but had since departed. Philippe frowned slightly, wondering if some messages had already slipped beyond his watch. Meanwhile, Walsingham extinguished the last candle in his study and settled into a high-backed chair, his thoughts weaving restless patterns. He could still recall the Queen's youthful laughter in days long past, before the burden of plots and wars had carved lines at the corners of her eyes. He closed his own eyes for a moment, listening to the faint murmur of the Thames lapping at the quays below and the creak of timbers settling for the night. The boy from the tavern crouched behind a rain barrel, clutching his thin woolen coat tightly against the chill. He saw the two strangers board a small skiff tethered at the dock. The boatman pushed away silently, the oars dipping soundlessly into the black water. The boy shivered, uncertain whether to follow or run back to the tavern with the tale he had overheard. Back in the palace gallery, the Queen traced the now faded lemon ink again with her eyes, committing the names to memory. She turned toward the hearth, where the flames had grown low, shadows lengthening on the carved oak walls. "There are too many secrets carried by this night," she murmured. Blanche did not reply. Instead, she gently added another log to the fire. A sudden gust rattled the doors to the courtyard, and a page hurried in with news. A messenger had arrived from the northern border, drenched and weary from riding hard through the storm. Elizabeth straightened, her voice composed but brisk. "Bring him forth." Moments later, the messenger entered, bowing deeply, his boots leaving wet prints across the rush-strewn floor. He handed over a small packet bound in oiled cloth to protect it from the rain. Elizabeth took it and with a single glance dismissed the page and the boy. The packet contained another letter, this one written in clear ink, but with a cryptic rhyme at its end, a signal known only to her and Walsingham. She exchanged a brief look with Blanche, whose brow furrowed, as though she sensed the danger wound tightly within those lines of verse. Outside the gallery, the storm clouds began to thin, revealing slivers of moonlight breaking over the Thames and the distant rooftops of London. As the palace settled into uneasy slumber, a lone nightingale sang from the hedges in the royal garden, its thin, sweet notes threading through the quiet corridors. The song seemed to echo faintly in Elizabeth's heart as she turned back toward the hearth and whispered, almost to herself, "Even in the darkest night, a bird still dares to sing." The messenger's footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the crackling of the hearth and the whisper of night air filtering through the gallery windows. Elizabeth unfolded the damp letter once more, tilting it toward the firelight. The ink shimmered faintly, as though reluctant to yield its secret. She read the cryptic rhyme aloud under her breath. each word curling softly into the air, where shadows meet the rising sun. A crown may fall when dawn is won. Lady Blanche leaned closer, her voice low and steady. Majesty, it speaks of a dawn meeting, perhaps a signal for uprising. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, though her tone remained gentle. Yes, Blanche, yet riddles are tools of those who fear open speech. Still, they must be read with care, for in their games they often reveal more than they intend. Far from Whitehall, Walsingham sat once again at his desk, the rain now a memory, leaving behind a sheen of dampness that clung to the night. He dipped his quill into fresh ink and began to copy certain passages from intercepted letters into a great, leather-bound ledger. The scratching of his quill filled the silence, steady and deliberate. At times, he paused to warm a page by the lamp flame, watching pale words appear, faint as ghostly whispers. Philippe entered quietly, carrying another sealed pouch. Intercepted on the northern road, he explained softly. Walsingham accepted it with a nod, cutting the wax seal carefully so it would not appear broken. Inside, a single page bore a list of names, some crossed out, some newly written. His eyes moved over them, his lips pressing into a thin line. Among them was a name he recognized from court, a courtier who often lingered too close to certain foreign ambassadors. Back at the riverside, the boy still crouched in the cold, his eyes fixed on the skiff, vanishing into the dark bend of the river. He bit his lip, torn between returning to the tavern and seeking someone who might listen to his tale. The night pressed heavily upon him, the silence broken only by the creak of mooring ropes and the soft splash of the river against stone steps. Elizabeth, having finished the cryptic rhyme, placed a letter into the folds of her gown. She walked slowly across the gallery, her slippers silent on the polished boards. At a tall window, she looked out over the sleeping city, rooftops gleaming faintly under a fragile moon. She thought of her people, countless and unseen, resting beneath those roofs. Their fate, so fragile, lay balanced upon each hidden letter, each whispered plot, each secret ink mark. Blanche moved to draw the curtains, but Elizabeth lifted a hand to stop her. "Leave them open," she said softly. "The night is no enemy. It shows us truths daylight hides." Together, they stood in silence, listening to the faint hoot of an owl in the palace gardens and the rhythmic tapping of a sentry's halberd against stone. In Walsingham's study, Philippe leaned closer to the ledger. "If this list proves true, it is more than whispers, sir. It is the skeleton of a plot waiting for flesh." Walsingham exhaled slowly, his eyes on the dying glow of the embers. "Then, let us be the surgeons who strip it bare before it learns to walk." Meanwhile, the boy at the docks finally rose to his feet, chilled to the bone. He turned toward the narrow lanes that wound uphill toward the city watch. As he hurried along, his footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestones, accompanied by the dripping of rainwater from eaves above. Though he was but a child, a thread of courage had found its way into his heart, weaving itself into the story of a kingdom's fate. Within the palace, Elizabeth's whisper carried through the still air. "Every letter is a lantern in the dark. Some light our way, others tempt us to fire." Blanche bowed her head, knowing her queen spoke both to her confidant and to herself. And so, the night deepened, filled with hidden ink, fading embers, and the weight of words unspoken. Dawn crept softly over London, a pale silver light brushing the mist that clung to the Thames. The riverboats drifted like slow shadows beneath the first stretch of morning sky, their masts glistening with beads of dew. A thin veil of fog lingered around the palace gardens, where the hedges shivered gently in the cool breeze. Queen Elizabeth had not slept. She remained seated near the hearth, her chin resting upon her hand, eyes half closed, yet alert to each creak of the timbers. Blanche entered quietly, bearing a small tray of bread and warm milk, and set it down without a sound. "Majesty," she whispered, "you should take something before the council gathers." Elizabeth gave a slight nod, lifting the cup to her lips with a slow, thoughtful motion. At Seething Lane, Walsingham had risen before dawn. He stood by the window watching the morning mist coil along the street, like breath from some ancient beast. The quill lay ready on his desk beside a stack of fresh parchment. He began to write a message to the Queen, detailing the names discovered overnight and urging swift action. Philippe's returned, his cloak damp with fog, carrying yet another intercepted letter, sealed with a foreign crest. In the same hour, the boy from the tavern finally reached a small guardhouse near the bridge. His clothes were still damp, his hair tangled from the night wind. The watchman at the door eyed him with suspicion, but the boy insisted on telling his story, speaking in hurried whispers of two strangers, a skiff, and a letter written in strange letters by torchlight. The watchman exchanged a skeptical glance with his partner, but sent a runner to Walsingham nonetheless. Back in the palace gallery, Elizabeth broke her fast in silence. The morning sun found its way through the high windows, casting long, golden streaks across the floorboards, revealing motes of dust that floated like tiny drifting stars. She looked toward them absently, as though finding in their slow dance a rare moment of calm. Blanche approached again, her voice soft as the breeze outside. "Majesty, the council awaits your presence by mid-morning. Shall I prepare your crimson gown?" Elizabeth turned her head slightly, considering. "No. The plain one of black velvet will do. A sober day calls for sober colors." Walsingham's messenger arrived at Whitehall's outer gates by the 9th hour. His boots caked with damp earth. He delivered the packet into the hands of the royal guard, who brought it swiftly to the Queen. Elizabeth unfolded the message with steady fingers, scanning the lines with practiced calm. As she read, her expression hardened, though her voice when she finally spoke remained soft, almost tender. "It seems the night has left its shadows behind for us to face in the morning." Meanwhile, across the river in a modest house, rented under an assumed name, the two French-speaking strangers dried their cloaks by a small hearth. They murmured to each other in low tones, debating whether their letter had reached the intended hands or fallen prey to the ever-watchful Walsingham. One of them, older and sharper, kept glancing at the window, as though expecting a knock at any moment. In Walsingham's chambers, Philippe's bent once more over the intercepted letter bearing the foreign crest. Holding it near a gently heated iron, he watched faint lines appear between the margins, hidden directions to a meeting at sunrise on the outskirts of the city. He looked up at his master, eyes gleaming. "Sir, the ink speaks. There is to be a gathering, perhaps of more than just two." The Queen's council assembled in a smaller chamber beside the great hall, its oak table polished to a dull glow in the morning light. Elizabeth entered quietly, her black velvet gown sweeping lightly across the rush-strewn floor. The men rose as one and bowed, their voices hushed in greeting. She nodded with a faint smile, then took her seat at the head of the table. Walsingham arrived moments later, bowing low before presenting his findings. He placed before her the ciphered letters, the list of names, and the note of a planned meeting at dawn. Elizabeth listened, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table, a habit she had whenever deep in thought. In a distant corner of the city, the boy sat near the watchman's fire, sipping warm broth offered to him for his bravery. He stared into the flames, feeling a curious mix of pride and unease at the role he had played in the night's discoveries. The morning mist began to lift from London's streets, revealing the market stalls being set up for the day and the first merchants calling softly to one another. Yet beneath the ordinary hum of the waking city lingered the unseen threads of conspiracy, delicate as cobwebs, but strong enough to ensnare the careless. Elizabeth, after hearing Walsingham's report, turned her gaze toward the window where sunlight now warmed the leaded panes. "Send word to the captain of the guard," she said quietly. "Let no meeting pass without our shadow upon it." A soft breeze slipped through the slightly opened casement, stirring the tapestry beside the council table. For a brief moment, the Queen closed her eyes, listening to it like a whispered promise that the day, however heavy with secrets, still carried the gentleness of morning. Night spread across London like a heavy velvet curtain, soft but full of shadows. The lanterns along the riverbank flickered in the breeze, their light stretching thin across the dark water. A mist crept low over the Thames, curling around the piers and whispering against the hulls of moored boats. Walsingham's small company rode in silence along the narrow lanes toward Bishopsgate, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp ground. The men kept their cloaks wrapped tightly against the chill, each aware that their mission required not steal but stealth. Philippe rode close behind his master, a satchel of ciphered notes strapped securely to his side. The boy from the watchhouse had begged the guard to let him stay awake by the window. His young eyes scanned the river, hoping to catch another glimpse of the lantern's signal. Somewhere in the distance, a barge creaked as the tide shifted, followed by the hollow call of a night heron. At the falcon-marked house, the conspirators moved quickly through the shadows of the alleyways. The hooded man led them, his steps sure on the slick cobblestones. They passed under an old stone archway and followed a narrow path that led to the bend in the river. The scholar clutched the parchment tightly beneath his cloak, its edges curling from the damp. In the Queen's private chambers, Elizabeth remained wakeful, seated in her carved oak chair beside the hearth. The fire had burned low, leaving a soft bed of glowing coals. Blanche sat opposite her, embroidering by the faint light of a single candle. The silence between them was companionable, filled with the occasional soft hiss of a shifting log in the hearth. "Do you ever tire of secrets, Blanche?" Elizabeth asked at last, her voice little more than a sigh. Blanche set her needle aside and met the Queen's gaze. "A secret kept is often a burden, Majesty, yet a secret uncovered is a blade. We must bear the weight to keep the blade from others' hands." Elizabeth gave a faint smile at her companion's wisdom, then turned her attention once more to the window. Beyond the glass, the river shimmered like a ribbon of dark silk beneath the moonlight. Down by the riverbank, the conspirators reached a chosen spot, a patch of gravel near the tall reeds. The hooded man raised a lantern and swung it once, then twice, before lowering it again. Its brief glimmers were nearly swallowed by the mist, but carried far enough to be seen by those who were watching. The boy gasped softly as he caught the flash through the haze and called for the watchman. Together, they peered out at the river, trying to be certain of what they had seen. The watchman frowned, then hurried to send a runner to the palace guard. Walsingham and his men approached the Priory Road in silence, dismounting at the edge of the shadows. He motioned for 2 men to circle to the rear of the Falcon House, while he and Philippe moved toward the river path. The sound of distant water lapping against the stones was the only witness to their careful approach. In the council chamber, left empty for the night, the candles had burned low, their wicks curling in the wax pools. The air held the faint scent of ink, parchment, and extinguished flames, reminders of the day's weighty deliberations. On the riverbank, one of the conspirators muttered anxiously, "We should not linger. The signal is sent. Let us return before the Queen's hounds catch our scent." But the hooded leader held up a hand for silence, his eyes fixed on the opposite shore as though expecting a reply signal. A soft rustle came from the reeds, followed by the crunch of footsteps on damp gravel. Walsingham stepped from the shadows, his cloak blending with the dark of the river night, his voice calm yet cutting through the mist. "Gentlemen, a fine evening for lantern games, is it not?" The conspirators froze, their faces paling in the moonlight. The scholar clutched the parchment tighter, his knuckles whitening. The hooded man straightened slowly, his posture that of one who has long expected this moment. In the palace, Elizabeth stood suddenly from her chair, as though sensing the unfolding encounter far from her sight. She walked to the window once more, gazing at the faint glow of lanterns near the river's bend. The night breeze stirred her hair gently, carrying with it the distant hush of the water. Walsingham's men moved forward with measured steps, their presence forming a silent wall behind their master. The hooded figure lowered his lantern and let it dangle by his side, saying nothing. Only the sigh of the river and the far-off cry of the night heron filled the heavy pause that followed. As the morning deepened toward noon, the damp scent of rain still lingered over the city streets, mingling with the aroma of fresh bread from the bakeries. The Queen's orders had already begun to ripple outward, unseen but swift. Couriers mounted horses in the palace yard, their hooves striking the cobblestones in muffled rhythm as they sped off toward the city gates. Walsingham remained at the Queen's side, speaking in a voice so low that even those nearest the door could not hear his words. "Majesty," he said, "their meeting place lies near the old Priory Road, beyond Bishopsgate. If we act before sunset, we may catch them unprepared." Elizabeth nodded once, her gaze steady. "See that it is done quietly." A net cast too hastily made tear. Blanche stood near the window, her hands clasped loosely before her, watching a shaft of sunlight break through the thinning clouds to light the gardens below. The rose bushes still glistened with drops from the night's rain, and the air hummed softly with bees newly awakened to the warmth. In a narrow lane near the Priory, the two French-speaking strangers entered a weathered stone house whose wooden sign bore the faded emblem of a falcon. Within, 3 other figures awaited them: a young man dressed as a scholar, an older merchant with careful eyes, and a tall figure cloaked in brown wool whose hood shadowed his face. They spoke in hushed tones, words laced with caution and fear. Meanwhile, the boy from the tavern had been brought to a small chamber at Seething Lane. There Philippe's questioned him gently about the strangers, sketching their faces in rough charcoal on a scrap of parchment. The boy nodded eagerly when shown the likeness of the older man, describing the way he held the parchment by the torchlight on the dock. At Whitehall, Elizabeth returned to her private study, where the hearth still glowed with the embers of the earlier fire. She unrolled a fresh map of the city and marked the Priory Road with a slender finger. Her expression remained serene, yet Blanche, who knew her well, saw the quiet resolve gathering like a tide behind her calm eyes. In the falcon-marked house, the hooded figure produced a small leather satchel and set it on the table. From within, he drew a sheet of parchment covered in delicate cipher. "Tonight," he whispered in accented English, "there is to be a signal sent by lantern from the river bend. 1 flash, then 2. If all is well, the men from the south will move at dawn." The scholar frowned, tapping the edge of the parchment. "But the Queen's men are vigilant. We risk discovery if even a single word slips beyond this room." The hooded figure merely shrugged. "Risk is the only bridge we have left." Walsingham's messengers returned with reports of the Priory Road. One of them spoke of unusual comings and goings at the old Falcon House, wagons arriving at odd hours with sacks of grain that seemed too heavy for mere flour. Walsingham dismissed the messenger and turned back to his ledger, noting every detail with his meticulous hand. That afternoon, the Queen's Council gathered again, their voices hushed but tense as they debated whether to arrest the suspects at once or allow them to reveal more of their plans. Elizabeth listened, her chin resting lightly on her hand. At length she said, "Let the lantern shine, if it will. Better to watch the serpent emerge than to strike at shadows." Near sunset, the sky burned briefly with streaks of gold and rose before fading to a deepening violet. The river reflected the dying light in gentle ripples. A soft wind rose, carrying the faint scent of damp reeds and wood smoke from the hearths of riverside cottages. The boy, now lodged for safety in a room above the watchhouse, pressed his face to the window, staring out at the twilight. In the growing dusk, he thought he saw a flicker of movement near the distant bend of the river, a single lantern raised, then lowered. He blinked, uncertain whether it was a trick of the failing light or the signal the strangers had planned. In the Queen's private chamber, Blanche lit a fresh candle as Elizabeth stood once again by the window. "The river holds many secrets," she murmured, "but night always draws them closer to the surface." Blanche placed the candle on the sill, its glow casting a warm circle in the gathering dark. At Seething Lane, Walsingham buckled his cloak and reached for his sword. Preparing to ride with a small company of trusted men toward Bishopsgate, he paused by the hearth, resting a hand on the mantel as though listening to the quiet counsel of the flames. Then stepped out into the cool night air, where the sound of distant bells marked the evening hour. The conspirators in the Falcon House gathered their cloaks preparing to depart for the riverbank. The hooded man extinguished a single candle on the table with a quick pinch of his fingers, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint silver glow of moonlight streaming through the cracks in the shutters. Above them all, the stars began to pierce the deep indigo sky, one by one, their silent watch unbroken as the city below held its breath for the night's unfolding. The silence on the riverbank stretched like a drawn bowstring, taut and fragile. The mist clung close to the reeds, making every shadow seem alive. A soft breeze passed over the water, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Walsingham stepped closer, his boots pressing into the damp gravel with a muted crunch. "There is still time," he said evenly, his voice low but carrying. "Lay down the lantern and surrender your letters. No harm need come of this night." The hooded man's shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. "You serve a queen who trusts no one," he replied, his accent shading each word. "And we serve a cause that trusts only itself. We are not so different." From behind Walsingham, Philippe spoke gently yet firmly. "The river has too long carried your secrets. Let the current bear them away now. You can choose peace before the tide changes." The scholar shifted uneasily, glancing at the others. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Perhaps we should heed them. The Queen's men have already found us." But the hooded leader raised a hand, silencing him. Across the water, the boy watched from the upper window of the watchhouse, straining to see through the mist. The watchman stood beside him, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder to keep him steady. The lanterns on the bank flickered faintly, their light breaking in silver ripples on the river's surface. Elizabeth, still at her window in the palace, felt the cool pain beneath her palm. Her breath clouded the glass slightly as she whispered, almost to the night itself, "May wisdom guide the hunter, and mercy temper his hand." Blanche, standing quietly behind her, said nothing, only lowering her eyes as if in silent prayer. On the riverbank, one of Walsingham's men shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking softly. The hooded man caught the sound and gave a short, rueful laugh. "Mercy is rare in such hours," he murmured. Walsingham's tone remained calm, almost gentle. "It is not mercy you should fear losing, but the chance to speak the truth while you still can." For a heartbeat, the night held its breath. Then the scholar stepped forward, his cloak falling slightly open to reveal the edge of the ciphered parchment. I will give mine up," he said, voice breaking. "I did not come for blood." The hooded man turned his head slightly toward the scholar, but said nothing. Slowly, the scholar extended the parchment toward Philippe's, who accepted it with care, rolling it swiftly into his satchel. The older merchant shifted his gaze from one man to the other and sighed, letting his own hands fall to his sides in surrender. "Enough of this hiding in the dark," he muttered. The hooded man alone stood unmoving, the lantern still swinging slightly in his grasp. At last he lowered his head, pulling back the hood to reveal a face lined with years of strain and sleeplessness. His eyes, dark and tired, met Walsingham's with a kind of weary defiance. "You may take us," he said quietly. "But the tide does not end with the capture of a few men. Another will rise when we fall." Walsingham regarded him for a moment in silence, then gave a slow nod to his men. "Bind them gently," he ordered. "This night has had enough violence in thought without adding it in deed." As the men stepped forward to secure the prisoners, the moon slipped behind a drifting cloud, softening the lantern glow to a muted halo. The river lapped against the stones as if to hush the human voices, keeping the secrets of their meeting for itself. At Whitehall, Elizabeth turned from the window at last, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She could not see what had transpired by the river, but something in the cool night air told her the danger had been stayed for now. Blanche replaced the candle on the table, the small flame steady and warm against the chill. "Majesty," she said softly, "perhaps now you may rest." Elizabeth nodded faintly, but remained standing a moment longer, listening to the distant sounds of a city settling into the deeper hours of night. Walsingham's men led the captives away from the riverbank in silence. The scholar kept his gaze on the ground, the merchant walked with slow, resigned steps, and the hooded man followed last, still carrying himself with the quiet dignity of one who knew his cause might outlive him. The boy at the watch house watched them go, a strange heaviness settling in his chest as he realized how quickly the world of whispers and hidden ink could draw ordinary lives into its grasp. The lantern by the river swung once more in the breeze before its flame sputtered and went out, leaving the water to the silver watch of the moon and stars. The silence on the riverbank stretched like a drawn bowstring, taut and fragile. The mist clung close to the reeds, making every shadow seem alive. A soft breeze passed over the water, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Walsingham stepped closer, his boots pressing into the damp gravel with a muted crunch. "There is still time," he said evenly, his voice low but carrying. "Lay down the lantern and surrender your letters. No harm need come of this night." The hooded man's shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. "You serve a queen who trusts no one," he replied, his accent shading each word. "And we serve a cause that trusts only itself. We are not so different." From behind Walsingham, Philippe spoke gently yet firmly. "The river has too long carried your secrets. Let the current bear them away now. You can choose peace before the tide changes." The scholar shifted uneasily, glancing at the others. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Perhaps we should heed them. The Queen's men have already found us." But the hooded leader raised a hand, silencing him. Across the water, the boy watched from the upper window of the watch house, straining to see through the mist. The watchman stood beside him, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder to keep him steady. The lanterns on the bank flickered faintly, their light breaking in silver ripples on the river's surface. Elizabeth, still at her window in the palace, felt the cool pain beneath her palm. Her breath clouded the glass slightly as she whispered, almost to the night itself, "May wisdom guide the hunter, and mercy temper his hand." Blanche, standing quietly behind her, said nothing, only lowering her eyes as if in silent prayer. On the riverbank, one of Walsingham's men shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking softly. The hooded man caught the sound and gave a short, rueful laugh. "Mercy is rare in such hours," he murmured. Walsingham's tone remained calm, almost gentle. "It is not mercy you should fear losing, but the chance to speak the truth while you still can." For a heartbeat, the night held its breath. Then the scholar stepped forward, his cloak falling slightly open to reveal the edge of the ciphered parchment. I will give mine up," he said, voice breaking. "I did not come for blood." The hooded man turned his head slightly toward the scholar, but said nothing. Slowly, the scholar extended the parchment toward Philippe's, who accepted it with care, rolling it swiftly into his satchel. The older merchant shifted his gaze from one man to the other and sighed, letting his own hands fall to his sides in surrender. "Enough of this hiding in the dark," he muttered. The hooded man alone stood unmoving, the lantern still swinging slightly in his grasp. At last he lowered his head, pulling back the hood to reveal a face lined with years of strain and sleeplessness. His eyes, dark and tired, met Walsingham's with a kind of weary defiance. "You may take us," he said quietly. "But the tide does not end with the capture of a few men. Another will rise when we fall." Walsingham regarded him for a moment in silence, then gave a slow nod to his men. "Bind them gently," he ordered. "This night has had enough violence in thought, without adding it in deed." As the men stepped forward to secure the prisoners, the moon slipped behind a drifting cloud, softening the lantern glow to a muted halo. The river lapped against the stones as if to hush the human voices, keeping the secrets of their meeting for itself. At Whitehall, Elizabeth turned from the window at last, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She could not see what had transpired by the river, but something in the cool night air told her the danger had been stayed for now. Blanche replaced a candle on the table, the small flame steady and warm against a chill. "Majesty," she said softly, "perhaps now you may rest." Elizabeth nodded faintly, but remained standing a moment longer, listening to the distant sounds of a city settling into the deeper hours of night. Walsingham's men led the captives away from the riverbank in silence. The scholar kept his gaze on the ground, the merchant walked with slow, resigned steps, and the hooded man followed last. still carrying himself with the quiet dignity of one who knew his cause might outlive him. The boy at the watchhouse watched him go, a strange heaviness settling in his chest as he realized how quickly the world of whispers and hidden ink could draw ordinary lives into its grasp. The lantern by the river swung once more in the breeze before its flame sputtered and went out, leaving the water to the silver watch of the moon and stars. Evening drifted back into London like a slow-turning tide, tinting the river with shades of bronze and violet as the sun sank behind the western horizon. The bells of St. Paul's tolled softly in the distance, each peal carrying a deep, resonant hum that lingered in the air before fading into the twilight hush. In the palace, the Privy Council gathered in a chamber lit by no more than a few tall beeswax candles. Their golden flames bent and swayed gently as the draft from the chimney brushed across the room. The scent of warmed wax mixed with the faint aroma of damp stone, grounding the room in the calm weight of centuries. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, her chin lifted slightly, her eyes reflecting the candlelight with a steady glow. Walsingham stood at her right, Philippe's behind him, clutching the translated parchment. The Queen's voice was soft, yet each word carried the precision of a drawn quill upon parchment. "Read it," she instructed. Philippe's unfurled the parchment carefully, the paper rustling like a whisper of dried leaves. His voice, though quiet, carried clearly in the stillness. "They write of promises wrapped in scripture, of a message hidden in the margins of a psalter, and of a name not yet known to us, who waits in the Low Countries for word that London's gates may open to him." The council shifted uneasily in their seats. One of the older lords cleared his throat softly, the sound small but noticeable. Elizabeth's fingers traced the carved edge of the oak table. "And this name, we cannot know it?" she asked. "Not yet, Majesty," Philippe's replied, "but the pattern of their words suggests a gathering of sympathizers across the channel, a bishop's nephew, perhaps, or a merchant with loyalty to another crown." For a moment, the Queen was silent, her eyes lowered, as if reading thoughts invisible to the others. The soft crackle of the candle wicks filled the pause like a gentle sigh. Walsingham broke the quiet in his calm, deliberate way. "Majesty, we can close the ports to certain vessels without raising alarm. A subtle net may catch this phantom before he steps ashore." Elizabeth looked up, meeting his gaze, her expression thoughtful but not hardened. "Do it with care. The river has seen enough chains of late." Outside the council chamber, Blanche waited in the hallway, holding a folded piece of velvet for the Queen's shoulders. She listened only faintly to the low murmur of voices within, catching fragments of words but never the whole. The sound of their discussion mingled with the muffled crack of burning logs from the distant hearth. When the council rose and dispersed, their footsteps echoed along the long wooden floorboards. Elizabeth lingered behind, gazing at the parchment once more before letting Philippe's roll it away and tie it with a simple cord. Later, in the quiet of her chamber, the Queen stood once again by her window. Night had spread over the garden, and the dew on the grass shimmered beneath a pale half-moon. Blanche gently draped the velvet mantle over Elizabeth's shoulders, her hands light as if not to disturb the weight of the Queen's thoughts. "The letters are locked away," she said softly, "and the river runs calm tonight." Elizabeth nodded faintly. "The river holds more secrets than the walls of this palace," she replied, almost dreamlike. "But even secrets grow weary of their own silence." Down by the water's edge, the boy from the watchhouse wandered again, drawn by the silver path of moonlight that danced upon the ripples. He crouched low, picking up a smooth pebble and tossing it gently into the current. The stone slipped beneath with a soft plop, leaving only a small circle that widened and faded. The hooded man, now imprisoned in the tower, sat on a wooden bench in his cell. A single candle flickered near the barred window, throwing slow-moving shadows across the stone walls. He hummed quietly to himself, an old tune from his homeland, the notes soft and low, filling the small chamber with a strange, calm sorrow. The scholar slept uneasily on his cot, the parchment he had surrendered still vivid in his dreams. The merchant stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the faint drip of water in the corridor outside. Through all the chambers of the tower, The night passed in muted stillness, the kind that wraps around even the most restless hearts and lets them drift, if only for a moment. Meanwhile, in the palace, the queen finally let her eyes close. Her breathing slowed as Blanche sat quietly nearby, watching the candle burn low and the shadows stretch long across the carved floor. Outside, the river moved steadily under the moon's pale gaze, carrying with it the memory of whispered plans, fading voices, and the hope that dawn might bring gentler hours. Dawn returned with a gentle mist that rolled across the river, carrying the scent of wet stone and the faint sweetness of early autumn leaves. The first rays of sunlight caught the edges of the tower's walls, painting them in a pale gold that softened the fortress's stern face. Inside the tower, the guards moved quietly, their boots echoing lightly in the arched corridors as they changed watch. The scholars stirred awake to the sound of distant gulls, their calls muffled by the morning fog. He rose, rubbing his eyes, surprised by the fragile peace of the dawn in so cold a place. The merchant was already awake, sitting near the barred window with his hands folded loosely, as though he had spent the night listening to the river's slow murmur. He looked out at the thin strip of sky, watching as the mist curled and lifted in delicate spirals. In another cell, the hooded man, now bareheaded, remained, seated, still humming softly to himself. The tune had changed to a lullaby, a half-forgotten song he once sang to his daughter when she was a child. The words were barely audible, but the melody carried the calm of distant memories, like ripples spreading across still water. At Whitehall Palace, Elizabeth awoke slowly to the muted light filtering through the heavy curtains. The sound of soft footsteps outside her chamber reminded her that the day's duties would soon begin. For a few precious moments, she lingered beneath the coverlet, her mind resting in the quiet before the first knock on the door. Blanche entered quietly, bearing a small tray with bread, honey, and a steaming cup of rosemary tea. The aroma filled the chamber with a faint, earthy fragrance that mixed pleasantly with the scent of beeswax candles. "Majesty," Blanche whispered gently, "the morning is calm. The council waits for your word on the prisoners." Elizabeth sat up, drawing her robe around her shoulders, her face thoughtful yet serene. "Bring them before us in the afternoon," she replied softly. "Let the morning be for stillness. We must not rush judgment upon weary hearts." In the privy chamber, Walsingham reviewed the ciphered parchments, again with Philippe's at his side. The two men worked in silence, save for the soft scratch of quills and the occasional murmur of discovery. A fresh breeze from the open window stirred the corners of the parchment, bringing with it the distant chime of a bell and the scent of damp earth. By midday, the prisoners were brought before the Queen's Council. The great hall was lit by rows of tall windows through which sunlight spilled like liquid gold, pooling upon the tiled floor in long, warm strips. Elizabeth entered quietly, her presence commanding yet softened by the daylight. She moved to her seat, the rustle of her gown the only sound as all rose in acknowledgement of her arrival. The hooded man stood first to speak. His voice was low but clear, carrying the weight of one who had spent long nights with his thoughts. "We believed our cause to be righteous," he said, "but perhaps in serving it, we have lost sight of the cost we lay upon our own souls." The scholar stepped forward next, his hands trembling slightly as he bowed. "Majesty," he said softly, "I confess to fear more than faith. I sought no harm, only a place to belong. I will answer for my part, yet I ask mercy for the boy I left waiting at home." A faint hush fell over the hall. Even the merchant, who had held his tongue until then, nodded in quiet agreement with the scholar's plea. Elizabeth regarded them with a calm, steady gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but carried through the chamber like the first drop of rain falling on a still pond. "The crown is not blind to the wounds that lead men to such paths. I will not let vengeance cloud the justice we owe one another." She turned to her counselors. "Let the scholar be confined for a season, that he may reflect and then return to his family. Let the merchant answer for his dealings with restitution, but not with the gallows." As for their leader, the hooded man bowed his head slightly, accepting whatever words would follow. Elizabeth's tone softened further. "He shall remain under watch within the tower, but not in chains. Let his words be heard in days to come, that we may learn if reconciliation can be sown where distrust has long been sown. The council murmured among themselves, but did not contest the queen's ruling. Blanche stood silently at Elizabeth's side, her presence as steady as the golden light streaming across the floor. She observed the prisoners, bowed heads, and saw the faint easing of tension in their shoulders as they realized their lives would not end at dawn's rope. Later that afternoon, as the council dispersed and the prisoners were led back to their quarters, the sky outside had begun to gather clouds tinged with rose and gray. A cool breeze brushed the garden leaves, making them rustle like pages turning in an unseen book. Elizabeth lingered by the window once again, gazing out at the shifting light on the river. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the many letters still to be written, the seals yet to be pressed, and the unseen hands across the sea plotting their next move. For now, though the river flowed steadily, indifferent to the schemes of men, carrying the last traces of daylight toward the horizon, night returned once more, this time wrapped in a silver hush, the river reflecting the last thin sliver of moon as if it were a curved blade of polished glass. The air had grown cooler, carrying the scent of distant wood smoke and the faint sweetness of drying hay from fields beyond the city walls. At the tower, the guards lit fresh lanterns along the stone walkways. Their flames cast soft pools of light that shimmered on the damp flagstones. The scholar, sitting on the edge of his cot, held his head in his hands, but not in despair, only in thought, as though he were tracing back every step that had brought him here. The merchant sat by the window, gazing at the lantern glow that reached across the courtyard like gentle fingers of gold. His sigh was almost inaudible, yet in the stillness it carried a sound like a door quietly closing on a chapter of his life. The hooded man rested with his back against the wall, his eyes half closed as he hummed that same soft lullaby again. The tune now seemed less sorrowful, more like a thread tying him to memories of gentler days. In Whitehall Palace, Elizabeth had retired early to her private chamber. The heavy drapes had been drawn, leaving only the glow of a few beeswax candles on the carved table beside her chair. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the faint ticking of a small gilded clock and the occasional pop of the hearth as the last logs burned low. Blanche entered quietly, carrying a silver basin of warm water scented with rose petals. Setting it gently upon the stand, she spoke in her softest voice, "Majesty, you should rest now. The council's work is done for the day." Elizabeth looked toward the basin, watching how the candlelight shimmered in the ripples of water. "Rest," she murmured with a faint smile. How strange a luxury that word becomes when a crown weighs on one's thoughts. Blanche smiled faintly in return, folding her hands before her. "Even a crown must bow to sleep at last," she said. Elizabeth dipped her fingers briefly into the warm water, savoring the small comfort of its heat. Her voice lowered further, as if speaking to herself. "If peace is to be won, it will be in these quiet hours, not with swords, but with words that wait patiently for the morning." Elsewhere, in the palace, Walsingham and Philippe's shared a muted conversation over a map spread across a narrow table. The candle between them cast their shadows against the wall like two tall sentinels leaning over a secret battlefield. "The ports are being watched," Walsingham said in his calm, even tone. "Any stranger bearing more than letters of trade will find the way to London less open than before." Phillips nodded, tapping one slender finger against the Low Countries on the map. "The phantom name may yet be found here. I will send for the cipher breakers at dawn to continue their work." "Let them rest tonight," Walsingham replied. "Fatigue blunts even the sharpest minds. Tomorrow will be soon enough." A quiet settled over the palace corridors as servants extinguished the last of the hallway lamps, leaving only the moonlight to slip in through the high windows. The night wrapped itself gently around the walls, as if London itself had decided to breathe a little slower for a while. Down by the river, the boy from the watchhouse once again found himself staring at the water's dark surface. Tonight, he carried no lantern, only a small smooth pebble in his palm. He whispered a wish into the cool air, not for riches or adventure, but for the city to stay as calm as it was in that moment. He dropped the pebble into the water and watched the ripples fade into the moon's reflection. At the tower, the hooded man lay on his cot staring at the ceiling beams, his hands folded across his chest. The faint sound of the river beyond the walls lulled him into a rare moment of stillness. The scholar finally lay down and closed his eyes, letting out a long breath that seemed to loosen the knots in his shoulders. The merchant drifted into sleep at last, the lantern light casting soft halos around the edges of the window. Elizabeth, seated by her hearth, let the last candle burn low as Blanche folded away her writing materials and placed the Queen's seal back into its small velvet case. The flame flickered once, then steadied, bathing the room in a gentle amber glow that seemed to hum with the warmth of the day's resolution. For a few precious minutes, the palace, the tower, and the river shared the same tranquil rhythm, the slow, measured beat of a city resting between its secrets and its dawns. The final hours of the night unfolded like the turning of a soft, velvet page. A faint mist began to gather over the Thames once more, curling upward like quiet breath, then slipping across the arches of the bridge before dissolving into the still air. In the tower, the lone watchman on the outer wall paced slowly, his lantern swinging with each measured step. The soft glow brushed over the ancient stones and caught the edge of the river below, tracing small ripples of gold upon the water. Within his cell, the hooded man awoke briefly to the muted creak of the guard's boots passing outside. He turned his face toward the window slit, watching a single star flicker faintly above the rooftops of London. A whisper escaped his lips, not words of anger or regret, but a simple breath that sounded almost like a prayer for the quiet to last. The scholar dreamed of his child's laughter, echoing down a narrow lane on a spring morning, and for the first time in weeks, a small, untroubled smile touched his sleeping face. The merchant shifted in his sleep, the hard wooden bench beneath him softened by dreams of his distant home, where the sea smelled of salt and pine resin, and the air was free of whispered plots. At Whitehall, the great halls slept too. The tapestries barely stirred, even when a soft breeze crept in through the high windows. The polished floors reflected the thin beam of moonlight, like silver ribbons winding across the quiet corridors. In her chamber, Elizabeth finally allowed her body to rest. Her breathing slowed, each exhale faint but steady. The lines of worry easing slightly from her brow as the candle beside her guttered lower. Blanche, seated nearby, with her hands folded in her lap, drifted into a light doze, her head gently leaning to one side. The small gilded clock on the mantel ticked on in the hush, its sound no louder than a heartbeat, counting the passing moments of a kingdom at rest. Out on the river, the boy returned once more, unable to resist the pull of the moonlit water. This time, he came barefoot, his toes curling in the cool, damp grass by the bank. He crouched low to watch a pair of swans glide silently past, their white feathers almost luminous against the dark current. He whispered to them as if they were old friends, and they moved on untroubled, leaving only a trailing V-shaped ripple behind. The bells of a distant church marked the hour past midnight, a single low tone rolling across the rooftops, deep and calming. In the privy chamber, where the parchment still rested beneath a sealed lock, the candle's last thread of smoke rose in a thin spiral as the wick gave in to the night. The faint scent of charred beeswax lingered in the still air, like the memory of a long conversation. In that moment, the whole of London seemed to hold its breath. The river, the towers, the bridges, the gardens, all wrapped together beneath the veil of a calm night sky. As the moon climbed higher, a soft breeze drifted over the city from the east, carrying with it the distant sigh of the sea beyond the Thames estuary. It was as if the tide itself had come to listen to the quiet, to bear witness to the hush that now lay like a blanket over the sleeping queen and her city. When the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the river brightened faintly, revealing a sheen of silver beneath the soft gray mist. The boy by the water watched as the world began to glow again, and he whispered one last wish, that peace might stay for at least one more day. Within the tower, the hooded man turned slightly toward the window slit, eyes opening to the pale gray light. He remained still, listening to the faint rush of water beyond the walls. The scholar stirred, sighing as if he had slept deeper than he expected, and the merchant blinked awake to the coolness of the morning air. Elizabeth opened her eyes just as the first ray of sunlight touched her window pane. For a moment, she simply watched it slide slowly across the floor, warm and patient, like a golden brush painting the stone. Blanche, sensing her queen stirring, rose silently and poured a fresh cup of tea infused with lavender. The steam curled up in the beam of sunlight, catching the golden specks like tiny stars dancing upward. The queen accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. Her voice, when she spoke at last, was soft enough to match the hush of the morning. "The river still runs," she said quietly, "and London still breathes. That is enough for today." The city, slow to wake, answered with the gentle creak of cartwheels on cobbled streets, the faint bark of a distant dog, and the rustle of wind among the flags. For that single morning, after nights of secrets and unspoken fears, London felt lighter, as though the tide had carried away the heavier shadows, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of life returning to its familiar path. And so the story of the secret letter came to its close, not with fanfare or clash of steel, but with the soft breath of dawn spreading across a city that had learned, for one night at least, the power of quiet vigilance and patient mercy. The first rays of dawn stretched gently across the waking city, sliding over the pitched rooftops of the fishmongers' huts near the wharf. A lone gull drifted in slow, patient circles above the Thames, its cry low and hollow as it glided down to skim the silver water. In a narrow lane beyond the eastern gate, the baker's young apprentice stirred beneath a woolen blanket in the corner of the shop. Still heavy with sleep, he rubbed his eyes and moved to the worktable, kneading pale dough with small, rhythmic presses of his fists. The soft thump and fold of the dough rose like a heartbeat within the stillness of morning. The laundresses carrying wicker baskets crossed paths at a corner where a lantern still flickered weakly against the lightening sky. Their quiet voices blended with the soft swish of their skirts as they brushed the dew from the cobblestones. At the tower, the hooded prisoner stood beneath the narrow slit of a window, his gaze drawn to the gull above the river. A distant memory stirred within him of boyhood days on the northern coast, where gulls wheeled over the cliffs and the scent of salt water was always near. The scholar leaned back against the damp wall, humming softly under his breath, a tune that was no louder than a sigh, but warm enough to ease the cold edge of the cell. Elsewhere in the palace, Sir Francis Walsingham lingered by his window, sleepless lines darkening beneath his eyes. With one fingertip, he traced the faint path of a raindrop that had dried overnight upon the glass, while his mind lingered on the coded words now sealed beneath the Queen's wax. A steward entered quietly, carrying a small basin of warm water, scented with rosemary, for the morning wash. A thread of steam rose and curled gently in the air, filling the room with a fleeting calm that Walsingham allowed himself to breathe in before turning back to duty. Across the courtyard, a troop of new guards entered with muffled steps, their boots crunching softly on the gravel. They kept their voices low, aware that the Queen preferred the stillness of early morning before the demands of the day began. Down by the river, the boy finally left his quiet perch among the reeds, stepping barefoot up the embankment toward the awakening market. His cupped hands still seemed to hold the memory of the swans gliding silently across the moonlit water. Queen Elizabeth, now fully awake, sipped her lavender tea as the sun climbed above the rooftops. Her eyes drifted toward the folded parchment tied in red ribbon and sealed with wax. The flicker of sunlight across the ribbon reminded her of the fragile thread on which loyalty so often dangled. She rose slowly, drawing her cloak about her shoulders. With a quiet word to Blanche, she asked that the council be summoned after the morning meal. There were questions yet to be asked, gently but firmly, in a tone that betrayed neither haste nor fear. In the market square below, the first cries of vendors rose with the morning air. The sing-song call of the fish seller, the metallic clink of copper coins against the bread counter. The heartbeat of the city quickened, little by little, though beneath it still ran the quieter current of hidden truths. Near the bridge, a cartwheel caught briefly in a rut between cobblestones. The driver coaxed his horse forward with a soft click of his tongue, unwilling to shatter the morning's calm with a whip or sharp word. The bell at St. Bride's tolled softly for morning mass, its low chime carrying a slow, even warmth across the river mist. Back in the tower, the merchant stretched his arms with a creak of weary joints, murmuring that he could swear he smelled the aroma of bread baking somewhere beyond the prison walls. The scholar gave a small, knowing smile and replied that even the air itself seemed to be offering them a little comfort. High above, the gull perched on the iron weather vane of the tower chapel, its head turned east toward the mouth of the river, as though it alone knew which ships might arrive on the next tide, and what messages or secrets they might bring. The morning light deepened into a soft gold as it crept along the stones of the palace courtyard. A gardener, stooped with age, moved silently among the queen's roses, brushing dew from the petals as if coaxing them awake. The scent of damp earth mingled with the sweet breath of the flowers, drifting upward to the high windows. In the royal kitchens, the gentle clatter of copper pots began, lids lifted carefully so as not to disturb the calm of the early hour. The warm aroma of oat bread and honeyed porridge spread like a comforting blanket through the lower halls, reaching even the sleepy guards at the postern gate. Elizabeth stood near her window, looking down upon the gardens. Her eyes softened for a moment as she watched a sparrow dip its wings into the marble basin of the fountain. She rested her fingertips on the cool glass, feeling the warmth of the rising sun just beyond it. Blanche approached quietly to adjust the queen's cloak and murmured that the council had gathered in the antechamber, waiting. Elizabeth nodded once, then turned back to the sunlight, letting herself draw a slow breath before facing the day's weight. In the council chamber, Walsingham unfolded a map of England across the polished oak table. His eyes traced the winding lines of roads and rivers, pausing where certain names had been marked in ink, no darker than a whisper. Each mark was a thread in the unseen web that he tended with such tireless care. Lord Burleigh, older and slower now, leaned upon his cane as he settled into his chair. The faint creak of the wood echoed in the high-ceilinged room like the sigh of an old tree bending in the wind. Elizabeth entered with quiet grace, her footsteps muffled by the thick weave of the rug. The lords rose in respect, bowing with the soft rustle of their robes. She acknowledged them with the smallest tilt of her head, then took her seat at the head of the table, her face composed yet thoughtful. Beyond the walls of the palace, London's streets swelled with the day's life, merchants calling out their wares, horses' hooves clopping against the cobblestones, distant church bells chiming the quarter hour. Yet here, inside the chamber, all sound dulled to a hush, as if the thick walls themselves conspired to keep secrets safe. In the tower, the hooded prisoner was led into a smaller, lamplit room to be questioned. The air was heavy with the scent of burning tallow and damp stone. His chains clinked softly with each step, but he held his head high, his expression unreadable beneath the shadows of his hood. The scholar watched silently as the guards passed by, his fingers wrapped around the iron bars of his cell. A fragment of Latin scripture drifted to his lips, not quite a prayer, not quite a lament, just a small, steady sound to fill the empty space. At the docks, a messenger disembarked from a flat-bottomed skiff, carrying a satchel sealed with the royal crest. His boots left damp prints on the planks as he strode toward the bridge, his breath puffing in the cool morning air. The boy who had watched the swans now stood at the edge of the market square, his eyes fixed on the messenger's satchel. Something about the seal made him curious, a spark of intrigue that tugged at his young mind. He said nothing, only watched as the man disappeared into the winding streets. A soft breeze picked up, carrying with it the mingled scents of river water, baking bread, and distant lavender from the palace gardens. In the queen's chamber, a single candle still burned low, its wax pooling slowly at the base. The flame fluttered briefly, though no draught touched it, as if even the candle sensed the weight of the morning's secrets. Elizabeth's voice was calm when she finally spoke to her gathered council. Her words fell into the still air like measured drops of water, each carrying quiet authority, each rippling across the room without raising its tone. Far above the city, the gull took flight again, its wings glinting in the rising sunlight as it wheeled eastward toward the horizon, as though drawn by some silent signal only it could perceive. The river glimmered below like a sheet of hammered silver, its surface broken gently by the oars of small boats ferrying traders. Fishermen, and messages of both honest trade and hidden schemes. For a moment, the queen let her gaze wander to the window and rest upon the river, thinking of how it carried both life and danger, both gifts and threats, all flowing unseen beneath the calm surface. The day grew brighter, but the heart of London still held its morning hush in the narrow lanes where sunlight barely touched the damp stones. Shadows clung to the arches of the bridges like folds of velvet, shifting only when the wind carried a ripple over the river's skin. At the tower, a guard paused at the edge of the parapet, leaning on his pike as he watched a barge pass below. Its oars dipped in rows and even strokes, leaving long dark trails that lingered behind like ink brushed across a parchment. Inside the chamber where the council sat, the queen rested one palm on the table's polished oak, the other upon the sealed parchment. Her gaze moved from Walsingham to Burleigh, and then to the small circle of men who waited for her to speak. "Let the truth come gently," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "But let it come all the same." Walsingham inclined his head slightly and began to read from a separate sheet of paper, his words carrying the weight of hidden names, coded signals, and letters intercepted by the ink made visible only by the heat of a flame. The chamber's single fireplace crackled softly as he read. The faint scent of burning oak drifted upward, mingling with the smell of warmed wax from the candles set in silver sconces along the wall. Outside in the courtyard, the gardener straightened from his work, rubbing his lower back. He looked toward the tower's upper windows and saw only the gleam of sunlight on glass. The distant chime of a bell signaled the hour for prayers, and he bowed his head briefly before returning to his roses. By the riverbank, the boy crouched low to trace shapes in the wet earth with a thin twig. He drew the outline of a ship and then a winding river that met the sea, his small hands steady despite the breeze that lifted strands of his hair across his brow. The hooded prisoner, seated again in the lamplit room, lifted his eyes toward the ceiling beams where a spider was weaving a slow, deliberate thread. He followed the spider's progress as though it might reveal some pattern only he could understand. The scholar in his cell had found a sliver of charcoal and scribbled faint words along the inner side of the stone wall. It was a single line of poetry, half in English, half in Latin, about the river carrying both secrets and redemption to the sea. In the marketplace, the sounds of haggling began to rise, breaking the stillness like pebbles dropped into a calm pond. Yet even there, a strange quiet lingered beneath the usual bustle, as if everyone sensed the unseen tide of events beneath the day's ordinary rhythm. At St. Bride's, the tall candles still flickered beside the altar. The priest's low chanting of the morning psalms drifted out through the open doors, echoing along the street like a slow and steady heartbeat. Walsingham's voice in the council chamber steadied as he concluded the reading. He folded the sheet carefully and met the Queen's eyes, waiting for her response. Elizabeth lifted the sealed letter at last, turning it in her fingers so the red ribbon caught the sunlight from the window. She held it a moment longer, as though weighing not the parchment itself but the choice it represented. Finally, she set it back upon the table and said, "A letter's words can spark a fire, yet sometimes it is the silence that saves the day. We shall let the silence work a little longer." The men nodded solemnly, the weight of her words settling upon them like the hush before a storm. At the same time, far beyond the city walls, a rider on a dark bay horse galloped down a country lane, his cloak snapping in the wind. He carried nothing more than a single sealed scroll tucked inside his leather jerkin, its destination known only to him and the hand that had penned it. As he crossed a small stone bridge, his horse's hooves clattered softly, echoing in the hollow arch beneath, a muted drumbeat carrying the sound onward toward the distant hills. In the palace garden, the sparrow that had bathed in the fountain earlier returned, hopping along the edge of the marble basin. It dipped its beak into the water once more, scattering droplets that sparkled briefly like tiny pearls in the sunlight. And somewhere across the river, in a modest brick house, a woman hummed a lullaby while folding clean linen, unaware that her quiet melody was drifting out the open window to the street below, weaving itself softly into the city's morning air. By mid-morning, the Thames shimmered like a path of broken glass under the strengthening light. Small boats ferried barrels of ale and bundles of wool between the docks and the market's upriver. Their oars dipped in slow, deliberate strokes, the sound blending with the gentle lap of water against the wooden piers. At the palace gates, a line of merchants waited with their carts, bolts of Flemish linen, baskets of spices from the Levant, even a crate of rare oranges wrapped in straw. The guards inspected each wagon carefully, their voices low but firm, their eyes flicking often toward the sealed gates as if expecting something unseen to appear. Inside the tower, the hooded prisoner sat once again in silence. But this time he traced a fingertip over the grooves carved long ago into the wooden bench where countless others had waited before him. His breath moved evenly, though his thoughts drifted like unsettled leaves caught in the slow swirl of the Thames current. The scholar leaned close to the small opening in his wall where a draft of river air slipped in. He closed his eyes, inhaling the faint scent of damp reeds and distant smoke from the wharf, and for a fleeting moment, it reminded him of freedom. The merchant shifted near the bars, watching the guards exchange a brief word at the end of the corridor. Their conversation was hushed, almost swallowed by the thickness of the stone walls. In the Queen's council chamber, a clerk entered, bearing a wooden tray lined with neatly folded correspondence, tied in ribbons of blue, green, and red. The clerk's soft footfalls hardly stirred the air as he placed a tray on the table and stepped back with a shallow bow. Elizabeth's gaze lingered on the sealed letters, but she did not yet reach for them. Instead, she rested her chin lightly against her knuckles, eyes fixed on the slow swirl of dust caught in a shaft of sunlight spilling across the table. Walsingham leaned forward slightly, as if to speak, but the Queen raised one hand in a small gesture of pause, a motion so subtle yet decisive that even the restless pages fell still. Outside the chamber, the muffled toll of another bell rippled through the courtyard, carried on a light breeze that stirred the curtains and fluttered the edge of a parchment map lying near the window. In a shadowed street near the docks, the boy who had watched the swans earlier now lingered near a cooper's shop, tracing idle circles in the dirt with his bare toe. He noticed a rider leading a tired horse toward the stables, the leather of the saddle darkened by travel and rain. The rider exchanged a few coins with the stable hand. His words, too quiet to reach the boy's ears, then disappeared inside the tavern across the way. The boy's eyes followed him with cautious curiosity, his mind weaving stories about far-off places and secrets carried in sealed scrolls. Back on the river, a barge passed under London Bridge, its deck stacked with casks marked for the royal kitchens. The ferryman hummed a slow tune to keep time with the oarsman's strokes, the melody carrying briefly across the water before being swallowed by the wind. In the palace gardens, Blanche bent to pick a small sprig of lavender that had survived the last rainfall. Its fragrance, gentle and cool beneath her fingers. She tucked it carefully into a small pouch tied at her waist, intending to place it near the Queen's writing desk later that day. Meanwhile, at St. Bride's, the priest extinguished 2 of the taller candles after the morning prayers were done, leaving only one flame burning beside the altar, a silent watcher in the quiet nave as footsteps echoed faintly across the flagstone floor. The day's warmth began to draw out the scent of baked bread from the streets near the market, mingling with the river breeze and drifting up toward the palace windows where the council still deliberated in patient, measured tones. A single raven landed on the tower's weathered battlements, its glossy feathers catching the sunlight before it tilted its head as if listening to the muted voices below. In the lamplit room of questioning, a scribe sharpened his quill with slow, deliberate strokes, the faint scrape of steel on feather adding a dry rhythm to the otherwise heavy silence. Elizabeth rose at last from her seat, the movement smooth and unhurried. She stepped toward the window and let her eyes wander across the distant rooftops of the city, the river winding like a silver ribbon through its heart. Her words, when they came, were quiet yet carried the weight of resolve. The river never stops its course, nor shall we. The room fell still again, the phrase lingering in the air like the last soft note of a distant bell. The sun climbed higher, scattering the mist that lingered over the rooftops. Yet the Thames still held a slow, pewter gleam, as if reluctant to surrender all its secrets to the daylight. Seagulls circled the docks, their calls sharp and brief against the softer hum of the waking city. Within the tower's inner court, a small group of soldiers assembled quietly, adjusting their belts and straightening the worn leather straps of their breastplates. The clink of iron buckles mingled with the muffled stamp of boots on damp stone. The hooded prisoner, left alone once more, sat with his back to the wall and tilted his head toward the window slit to watch a faint sliver of sky. A cloud drifted lazily across his view, its edges glowing like silver thread against the pale blue. The scholar leaned closer to the writing he had scratched into the wall earlier, his fingertips tracing the faint words as if the touch alone might steady his thoughts. A thin breeze carried the scent of river mud and the distant temps of sea salt into the cell. In the bustling market square, the boy who had watched the writer now wandered between stalls of fresh bread, woven baskets, and bright bolts of cloth. His gaze shifted often toward the tavern door where the traveler had disappeared. A pair of fishermen passed by, carrying nets still wet and glistening with morning catch, their low voices telling of a strange object glimpsed in the river at dawn. Something like a sealed cask drifting north with the current before vanishing beneath the bridge. At Whitehall, Elizabeth walked slowly along the gallery, her hand grazing the dark wooden paneling as she went. The corridor smelled faintly of beeswax polish and lavender from the gardens below. Each step she took echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Blanche followed at a respectful distance, holding a small folded fan in her hands, though the air was still cool. She glanced often toward the Queen's face, but said nothing, sensing the weight of unspoken thoughts. In a far wing of the palace, Walsingham studied a set of ciphered notes spread across his desk. A thin candle burned beside them, though the daylight streamed through the window. Its flame flickered in the draught as if wary of the secrets it illuminated. Outside the window, a pair of pigeons perched along the roof's edge, cooing softly as they tucked their heads beneath their wings. Their quiet presence contrasted with the tense stillness in the room. By the riverbank, a barge carrying barrels of fresh water for the palace kitchens slid past a weathered pier. The ferryman raised a hand to a dockside cooper, who returned the gesture with a nod, neither man needing to exchange words. In the lamplit, questioning chamber, the scribe's quill moved steadily across a fresh page, recording the brief remarks of a guard who reported seeing the prisoner awake long past midnight. The scratch of the quill was the only sound that filled the air. A cart bearing bundles of wool rattled across the cobblestones of the bridge, scattering a few pigeons that flapped upward before settling again on the carved stone balustrade. Back in the palace gallery, Elizabeth paused at a tall, arched window overlooking the gardens. Sunlight caught in the dew, still clinging to the grass below, turning each droplet into a tiny spark of gold. Her reflection in the glass appeared faint and distant, as though she were peering at another figure across time. She breathed out slowly, watching her breath briefly cloud the cool surface before fading. The Queen turned to Blanche with a soft, deliberate tone. "The river holds its whispers," she said, "but not forever. We must be ready when it speaks." Blanche inclined her head without reply, her fingers tightening briefly around the folded fan. At that very hour, far down river, the lone rider, who had crossed a stone bridge earlier, now slowed his horse at a fork in the road, consulting a small scrap of parchment no larger than his palm. A gust of wind tugged at the edges of the paper, but he shielded it carefully before tucking it back inside his jerkin. The rider urged the horse forward again, hooves beating a soft, steady rhythm as they continued along the narrow lane lined with hedgerows. Overhead, a raven followed at a distance, its shadow slipping across the sunlit path like a fleeting omen. A faint haze rose where the lane dipped toward the riverbank again, the air carrying the mingled scents of damp hay, distant smoke, and the sharp tank of river reeds. At St. Bride's, the single remaining candle by the altar burned low, its flame dancing faintly as if bowing to the filtered sunlight streaming through the stained glass above. And on the tower's highest wall, the first raven that had perched earlier let out a single, coarse cry before spreading its wings and gliding out toward the far horizon. A hush fell over the tower courtyard as the morning bustle drifted toward the city gates, leaving behind the echo of footsteps on damp stone. A thin veil of mist rose from the riverbank, curling in slow spirals as if reluctant to let the day begin. In the prisoner's cell, a droplet of water formed at the edge of the window slit and slid down the cold stone wall, tracing a faint dark line that ended at the floor. The prisoner watched it idly, his eyes heavy but alert beneath the shadow of his brow. From the far corridor came the muffled creak of a cartwheel as a kitchen boy delivered a tray of bread and watered wine for the morning meal. The boy hummed under his breath, a simple tune that faltered when he glanced at the heavy wooden door of the cell. Above them, the bell at St. Bride's told a single, low note, a slow, hollow sound that carried across the rooftops like a sigh. At Whitehall, Elizabeth seated herself at a carved writing table near a sunlit window. The surface bore faint scratches from years of quills pressed too hard in moments of urgency. Beside her lay an inkwell of dark iron gall and a small silver seal stamped with her crest. Blanche stood silently by the window, her gaze lowered to the garden below, where gardeners in plain woolen tunics trimmed the hedges into careful geometric shapes. The clipped branches fell in soft cascades onto the damp earth. A servant entered, bearing a small wooden box lined with velvet. He knelt as he presented it, lifting the lid to reveal a fresh supply of blank parchment and a narrow-bladed penknife. Elizabeth dipped her quill and paused, her eyes catching the way sunlight struck the blade of the knife, a brief flare of light that vanished when the servant lowered the lid. Elsewhere in the palace, Walsingham descended a narrow staircase into the archive vault, where rows of shelves held scrolls and ledgers smelling of dry parchment and ink. A single lantern swung gently in the cool air, throwing restless shadows against the walls. The spymaster's assistant waited at the bottom step, clutching a folded document sealed in dark red wax. His lips pressed into a thin line as he handed it over, his hand trembling slightly before retreating. The document bore a single symbol instead of a name, its wax seal unbroken. Walsingham studied it for a long breath, then slid it into the inner pocket of his coat without comment. By the river, a fisherman knelt beside his small boat, repairing a torn net with deft, practiced fingers. His companion sharpened a rust-specked hook against a flat stone, the rasp of metal on stone blending with the soft lap of water at the pier. A pair of washerwomen approached the shallows carrying baskets of damp linens. Their chatter faded into whispers as they noticed a distant figure in a dark cloak leaning against a post near the bridge. The figure's face remained hidden by the shadow of the hood as he flicked a pebble into the water, watching the ripples break the river's calm surface. On the bridge above, a vendor sold warm pies to early travelers, the flaky crust steaming in the cool air. He called out in a gruff but friendly tone, drawing a few sailors who lingered with coins clinking in their palms. Back in the tower, the scholar prisoner shifted closer to the wall and began murmuring verses under his breath, perhaps prayers or fragments of a song. His voice was low and almost tuneless, carrying a hint of the chapel's solemn cadence. The guard outside the cell door adjusted his stance, tapping the butt of his pipe lightly on the flagstone as if to shake off the chill that had crept into his legs. At the Queen's writing table, Elizabeth laid her quill aside and gazed at the garden once more. A lone blackbird hopped across the damp grass, pausing now and again to tilt its head as though listening to distant sounds beneath the soil. Blanche stepped closer, finally speaking in a low, careful tone. "Your Majesty, shall I summon the council at noon?" Elizabeth's response came softly, as if she was speaking to herself as much as to Blanche. "Not yet. The day is still gathering its truths. Let us hear what the river brings first." The words lingered in the room, carried by a breeze that stirred the parchment at her elbow, lifting one corner before letting it fall again. Near the wharf, the hooded rider dismounted, his boots striking the planks of the dock with a muted thud. He tethered his horse to a post and exchanged a quiet word with a barge captain who nodded toward the downstream current. They spoke in short sentences, their voices hushed beneath the rattle of chains as another boat shifted in the water nearby. Far above, a raven wheeled in slow circles, its cry sharp but brief, before it disappeared into a bank of pale clouds rolling inland from the sea. At the tower gate, A small party of guards changed shifts, saluting one another in silence, as the heavy iron-bound door groaned open, just enough to let the departing men pass through. Inside the cell, the prisoner tilted his head back and closed his eyes for a long moment, as though listening to something only he could hear. The steady rhythm of the river against the stones below, or perhaps the faintest echo of footsteps receding down the corridor. The sky above London shifted from pale gray to a softened hue of gold as sunlight threaded gently through scattered clouds. The mist along the river began to lift, revealing the curve of moored ships whose masts swayed almost imperceptibly with the slow current. A bell from the far end of the bridge rang twice, its tone lighter now, greeting the waking city with a promise of warmth after the long, damp night. On the wharf, a boy unrolled a coil of rope, the coarse hemp scraping against the wooden planks. He worked quietly, mindful not to disturb the hooded rider, still leaning on the post, watching the flow of the river as though it carried unspoken answers. A flock of pigeons burst from the eaves of a warehouse when a cart rolled by, scattering into the air before settling again on the cobblestones, pecking at crumbs left behind by the morning vendors. In Whitehall's gardens, a light breeze stirred the dew-soaked leaves. The scent of damp earth and crushed lavender drifted toward the open window where Elizabeth sat, her eyes fixed on the distant rooftops of the city. Blanche returned with a small porcelain cup of freshly brewed rosemary tea. The steam rose in thin, graceful spirals that vanished in the cool air before reaching the Queen's face. Elizabeth accepted the cup with a faint nod and traced her thumb over the painted rim, her expression unreadable as she considered the sealed letter resting beneath her palm. Walsingham entered the chamber without sound, his steps as measured and soft as a shadow crossing the floor. He bowed slightly before approaching the table. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice low and steady. "The rider returned at dawn. The message we expected is incomplete." Elizabeth's gaze lifted to meet his, her eyes calm yet carrying the weight of unspoken questions. "Incomplete," she repeated softly. Walsingham drew from his coat the folded paper marked only with the strange symbol in red wax. He placed it carefully on the table, allowing her to study the seal. The Queen did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she let the moment linger, her attention drifting briefly to the faint sound of a lark singing beyond the window. At the tower, the prisoner shifted closer to the cell door, drawn by the muffled sound of footsteps in the corridor. He could hear the scrape of a key turning in a lock, followed by the low murmur of two guards exchanging a few guarded words. Through the narrow slit of the window, the prisoner saw a barge gliding along the river, its dark hull cutting a smooth line through the morning's reflection of clouds. In a nearby chamber, the chaplain knelt at his small altar, his whispered prayers mingling with the distant toll of another church bell. The scent of beeswax candles and damp stone filled the room. A courier arrived at the tower gates carrying a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. The guards inspected his token before letting him pass, their expressions betraying no curiosity about the letter he carried. The hooded figure by the river finally moved, pulling the cloak tighter around his shoulders before making his way toward the crowded lane that led uphill to the city. His stride was measured, neither hurried nor slow, his boots leaving damp prints on the cobbled path. At Whitehall, Blanche poured a second cup of tea for Walsingham, setting it down without a word. The spymaster inclined his head in thanks, but left it untouched, his eyes fixed instead on the sealed paper. Elizabeth finally broke the wax seal with a decisive motion, the brittle crack of wax sounding louder than the soft wind stirring the curtains. Inside the letter, the ink appeared faint, at first glance, a scattering of brief phrases in hurried script. Yet beneath the surface, subtle marks suggested that more words might be hidden in the fibers of the paper itself. "Lemon," Walsingham murmured, recognizing the faint pattern of invisible ink. He called for a candle to be brought, and soon the warm flame flickered beneath the parchment's edge. Slowly, as the paper warmed, the ghostly shapes of letters emerged, uneven lines spreading across the page, like secrets rising from the depths. Elizabeth leaned closer, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the candlelight. her expression steady as the words revealed themselves, one by one, beyond the chamber doors. The sound of a lute being tuned drifted faintly from the music room where a court musician prepared for the day's performance. The notes wavered in the still air, oddly tender against a quiet tension unfolding around the letter. At the river's edge, the fisherman lifted his repaired net and cast it gently into the water, its ripples gliding outward in near-perfect circles. The washerwomen gathered their baskets and began to climb the steps toward the market square, their skirts brushing against the damp stone and leaving dark, wet trails behind. In the garden below, the blackbird hopped to a higher branch, singing a short, sweet phrase before falling silent again, as if listening to the voices in the chamber above. Elizabeth's lips moved silently as she read the final line of the letter, her brow furrowing just enough for Blanche to notice, though she remained still and unintrusive. Walsingham's eyes narrowed slightly, and he folded his hands behind his back, waiting for the Queen to speak. But Elizabeth said nothing yet. She let the parchment rest upon the table as the flame beneath it flickered lower, casting shadows that trembled across her face and the carved wooden walls of the chamber. The candle's flame bent slightly under a draft that slipped through the open window, making the shadow of the letter dance on the table. Elizabeth pressed the parchment flat with her fingertips as though to keep its secrets from slipping away. Walsingham moved closer, his eyes following the slow rise of invisible words as they darkened fully in the heat. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's coded further, Majesty. We'll need the key." Elizabeth gave a faint nod but kept her gaze fixed on the last sentence, revealed a brief phrase that mentioned a name long absent from court. Her lips formed the name silently, as though speaking it aloud might disturb the stillness of the room. In the courtyard below, the sound of hooves striking cobblestone echoed briefly as a small group of messengers departed toward the northern roads. Their figures dwindled behind the garden wall, their cloaks lifting in the breeze like dark wings. Blanche crossed the room with light steps, closing the window shutters to steady the flickering candlelight. The soft clap of wood against wood dulled the distant hum of the waking city. At the tower, the chaplain finished his prayer and rose slowly, smoothing the folds of his robe before heading toward the cells. His footsteps were calm, carrying the steady rhythm of habit and devotion. The prisoner tilted his head as the chaplain approached, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second through the narrow opening in the door. Neither spoke, yet something in their brief exchange suggested a quiet understanding that both knew the silence held its own kind of language. From beyond the tower walls came the sharp cry of a raven perched on a rooftop. The bird's call echoed across the stones, startling a guard who turned his head quickly toward the sound. The guard returned to his post by the gate, shifting his weight as he leaned against the pike he carried. A moment later, he adjusted the strap of his leather glove with the quiet creak of worn buckles. In Whitehall's great hall, servants swept the stone floor with straw brooms, gathering the dust into neat piles before the first visitors would arrive. Their movements were slow, their brushes making a soft scraping sound, like distant waves on sand. Meanwhile, Walsingham opened a small iron box from his belt pouch, removing a folded scrap of paper on which strange symbols had been drawn in ink. He laid it beside the letter. Elizabeth leaned forward, resting her chin lightly upon her hand, her eyes steady as Walsingham aligned the symbols with the emerging lines of text. The slow, deliberate motion carried a sense of patience forged through years of intrigue. In the corner of the chamber, the candle guttered slightly as its wax softened and dripped down the brass holder. The scent of warm beeswax lingered faintly in the air. The garden beyond the shutters grew quieter, the wind settling as if nature itself was waiting for the meaning of the message to unfold. At the far end of the palace corridor, a young page hurried with a folded document in his hand, his soft shoes barely making a sound on the polished wooden floor. He stopped short outside the Queen's chamber, hesitating to knock. The boy took a quiet breath, steadied his grip on the parchment, and finally tapped 3 times on the heavy oak door. Blanche turned toward the sound, then opened the door just enough to admit the page. The boy bowed quickly, eyes lowered, as he offered the paper to the Queen's lady. Elizabeth watched silently as Blanche accepted the message, unfolded it, and skimmed its contents before handing it to her. The Queen's brow arched slightly as she read the brief note, an invitation to attend the council chamber sooner than expected. Still, she set the note aside. Her attention returned to the letter, warming under the candle flame. At the tower's water gate, a barge arrived carrying barrels of salted fish for the garrison. The boatmen worked quietly, passing the barrels to one another in a steady rhythm, the hollow thump of wood against wood echoing in the misty air. On the river, sunlight glinted faintly off the tip of a pole as a ferryman guided his skiff between moored vessels. The gentle ripple of water against the hull filled the silence between his strokes. In the cell, the scholar prisoner traced a line of mortar in the wall with his fingertip, as though following an invisible map carved into the stone. He paused now and again, tilting his head to listen for distant sounds. The chaplain stood outside the cell, holding a small book bound in cracked leather. He spoke a few words softly, a verse of comfort that drifted into the room like a breeze from a half-open window. At Whitehall, Elizabeth closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if to gather her thoughts. When she opened them again, they were sharper, focused on the words, forming a clearer message before her. Walsingham, noting the change in her expression, lowered his voice further. "Majesty, this may confirm the presence of a traitor in the court, though not the one we first suspected." Elizabeth's response was calm but quiet, her words barely carrying across the table. "Then the shadow grows closer than we thought." Her tone, steady and unhurried, carried no fear, only the weight of decisions waiting to be made. Outside the chamber, the page lingered for a heartbeat before retreating down the corridor. His steps light and swift as though eager to leave the charged silence behind. The palace corridors grew busier as the morning deepened, yet the soft rush of footsteps and muffled voices never fully disturbed the hush inside the Queen's chamber. The heavy door remained closed, guarding the quiet exchange between Elizabeth and Walsingham. A breeze pushed gently against the shutters once more, carrying with it the faint scent of the garden damp soil, clipped rosemary, and the sweetness of early blooms. Elizabeth straightened in her chair, brushing a stray lock of hair from her brow. "This name," she murmured, pointing to the half-revealed line at the edge of the letter, "has not been spoken here in years." Walsingham inclined his head. "A ghost returns, perhaps, or merely someone who never truly left." On the river below the tower, a small rowing skiff glided silently past the stone arches of the bridge. Its lone passenger sat hunched beneath a hood, the dip and rise of the oars the only sign of motion against the still water. The barge that had delivered the barrels of salted fish departed downstream, its wake rippling softly toward the riverbank where the fisherman mended his net in silence. A cloud shifted overhead, and sunlight broke briefly across the tower's ancient stones, making the mossy walls gleam damply before retreating behind another veil of gray. Inside the tower's guardroom, two men sat at a small wooden table, sharing a loaf of bread. Their conversation was hushed and halting, marked by long pauses where they simply chewed in silence, each lost in private thoughts. In the prisoner's cell, the scholar crouched beside the narrow slit of light and began to hum again, the same low, wandering tune he had sung before, though now slower, as if the melody itself had grown weary. The chaplain returned, carrying a small cup of watered wine. He passed it carefully through the gap in the door, and offered a soft word that sounded more like a blessing than a greeting. At Whitehall, Blanche lit another candle, placing it beside the first, so that both flames cast a steadier light over the parchment on the table. The two flames wavered and swayed toward each other, as though drawn by a silent breath between them. Elizabeth's eyes traced the coded message again, her expression tightening only slightly as she reached the final hidden line. Walsingham's fingers hovered over the edge of the paper, stopping short of touching it. "If this is true," he said, his tone low, "then the plot was closer to the heart of London than we guessed. The letter hints at a meeting tonight." Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her gaze unfocused for a moment, as though she were looking past the walls of the chamber to the streets beyond. "So it moves quickly," she whispered. A knock came at the door, soft, deliberate. Blanche glanced toward the queen for permission before opening it just enough to admit a senior courtier. His powdered sleeves still flecked with dust from his hurried walk across the courtyard. He bowed low. "Your Majesty, the council gathers and awaits your word." Elizabeth's voice was calm as she replied, "Tell them I will join them when the sun begins to descend. For now, let them wait." The courtier bowed again and withdrew without further word. At the tower, the guard by the gate was joined by a messenger on horseback, the animal's coat slick with river mist. The rider leaned down to speak quietly to the guard, handing him a sealed token before urging the horse onward into the city streets. The guard studied the token, then slipped it into his pocket with a glance toward the prisoner's wing. A moment later, the raven returned to its perch atop the tower gate, shaking out its black feathers as if shaking off the drizzle still clinging to its wings. Farther down river, the barges passed each other without greeting, each crew focused on their own course, their oars dipping in perfect, silent rhythm. In the Queen's chamber, Walsingham rolled the parchment carefully and secured it with a strip of plain ribbon. "We must tread carefully, Majesty. The river carries more than fish and trade. Tonight, it may carry whispers meant to undo the crown." Elizabeth met his gaze and gave a single, deliberate nod. "Then let the river whisper," she replied softly. "We will be listening." The blackbird in the garden sang a short, tentative trill before falling silent again, as if even the bird sensed the gravity settling over the palace. Blanche replaced the now dripping candle with a fresh one, the wick catching with a faint crackle. The new flame burned, steady and bright, throwing a warm circle of light over the table as the day outside grew more overcast. At the tower's chapel, the chaplain lingered by a stained-glass window, his eyes following the patterns of colored light scattered across the flagstone floor. The hues of crimson and blue shifted faintly as clouds moved overhead. The prisoner closed his eyes at last, leaning back against the cold wall, his breathing slow and even neither sleep nor full wakefulness, but a kind of waiting that echoed the stillness of the whole city. The day darkened sooner than expected as a fresh layer of clouds gathered over London, heavy and low, dimming the streets beneath a quiet gray. The marketplace, once lively, grew subdued as vendors lowered the flaps of their stalls to shield their wares from the damp air. On the river, the tide turned, carrying with it the brackish scent of the sea. Boats rocked gently against their moorings, their ropes creaking in the soft current. A ferryman hummed an old tune while mending a loose plank on his skiff. The song was broken now and then by the splash of water against the hull. At the tower gate, the raven shifted uneasily on its perch, shaking droplets from its feathers as drizzle began to fall once again. Inside the tower, the chaplain lit a small lantern, its warm glow pushing back the gloom in the narrow corridor that led to the prisoner's cell. The faint smell of tallow filled the air. The prisoner opened his eyes as the lantern's light seeped beneath the door. He tilted his head, listening to the distant murmur of men's voices outside the cell. Words too low to catch but urgent in their tone. In the guardroom, two soldiers bent over a rough-hewn table, their heads close together as they studied a map spread beneath their elbows. A half-finished mug of ale rested nearby, forgotten in their concentration. At Whitehall, the council chamber filled slowly with courtiers and advisers, their footsteps echoing against the high-vaulted ceiling. The large hearth crackled with the beginnings of a fire, its flames licking softly at the logs and filling the air with the scent of oakwood smoke. Elizabeth entered the chamber without announcement, her presence quiet yet commanding. The councilors rose as one, bowing low before resuming their seats at her subtle gesture. Walsingham stood at her right, holding the rolled parchment bound in the plain ribbon. His expression remained unreadable, though his eyes swept the faces gathered around the long oak table. The Queen's voice, when she spoke, was soft but carried easily in the hushed hall. "Gentlemen, there is a matter we must discuss, one that rides beneath the current of the river, hidden but swift." Several heads tilted at her words, but no one interrupted. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of wind against the stained-glass windows. At the far end of the table, an older nobleman adjusted his signet ring nervously, the metal scraping against the wood. Elizabeth continued, her tone steady. A letter has been received, one whose words were meant to remain unseen. It speaks of a meeting tonight, here in our city. A murmur rippled through the council, quickly silenced by a sharp glance from Walsingham. Meanwhile, at the river's edge, the hooded rider returned, his horse's hooves muffled on the wet planks of the dock. He tied the reins loosely to a piling and looked toward the tower, as if measuring the distance. A fisherman nearby cast a sidelong glance at the stranger, but kept silent, focusing on his nets. The drizzle thickened, softening the outlines of the buildings along the quay and blurring the distant lanterns into halos of gold. Inside the tower, the chaplain moved to the small altar again, striking a flint to light another candle whose tiny flame danced unsteadily in the draught. The prisoner leaned forward on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together, eyes fixed on the wavering light that flickered beneath the doorframe. In the palace garden, the black bird found shelter beneath a yew hedge, shaking its feathers and watching with one bright, unblinking eye as droplets collected at the edge of the leaves. Elizabeth listened to her counsel's cautious suggestions with a serene expression, occasionally tracing a fingertip along the carved arm of her chair. Her silence carried more weight than any spoken word. Walsingham unrolled the parchment at last and laid it before the council, revealing the half-faded lines that hinted at betrayal. His voice remained calm as he explained the circumstances of its discovery. The councillors leaned closer, brows furrowed as they examined the ink stains and the faint smudges left by the candleless heat. At the tower gates, the guards replaced their torches as daylight dimmed, each flame sputtering in the moist air before flaring to life. On the river, a passing barge struck against a submerged log with a dull thud, rocking the boatmen who muttered under their breath as they steered it carefully back into the main channel. The prisoner in his cell began humming again, the same low tune now softened to near silence, as if he sang not for anyone else, but to keep the stillness company. Back at the council chamber, Elizabeth finally spoke again, her tone soft yet unwavering. If the letter is true, then our choices are few. We must move quietly before the shadow steps deeper into the heart of this court. The councillors exchanged uneasy glances, their faces reflecting the flickering glow of the hearth. The council chamber held its breath after the Queen's words, the silence broken only by the faint hiss of a log collapsing into embers on the hearth. The air carried the scent of burning oak, mixed with the damp chill drifting in from the hall. Elizabeth rested both hands on the carved arms of her chair, her gaze sweeping slowly across the table. "We will not let fear rule this night," she said quietly, "but we will not underestimate it either." Walsingham inclined his head, the candlelight catching in the sharp lines of his face. "Majesty, if the meeting is to take place by the river, we must have eyes in the shadows before the moon rises." A younger counselor, his voice tight, spoke up. "We cannot be certain this is not a snare to draw our men out." Elizabeth's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, one without warmth. "That is why we send only shadows to watch shadows." The counselors shifted uneasily, but nodded. Outside, the drizzle turned to a fine, misting rain. Water pooled in the grooves of the cobblestones where lantern lights shimmered like shards of brass. The hooded rider lingered near the wharf, his gloved hand tracing the edge of a mooring post, as if counting the rings in the wood. Further downstream, a barge loaded with casks of wine moved toward the palace, its lantern casting a golden oval across the river's surface. In the tower guardroom, the two soldiers, still bent over their map, lowered their voices to near whispers. One traced a finger along the line of the river, stopping at a narrow inlet hidden beneath the shadow of the bridge's arch. The prisoner sat unmoving now, his hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes half closed as he listened to the distant creak of oars on water. The chaplain approached the cell again and set down a small loaf of coarse bread beside the door. His voice was soft, almost tender. "You must keep your strength, my son. The night may test you more than the day has." In the palace garden, the blackbird fluttered higher into the yew branches as the rain thickened, ruffling its wings and tucking its head beneath one. A pair of servants hurried across the courtyard, carrying a brazier to keep the council chamber warm, the coals glowing faintly beneath a shield of iron mesh. Blanche replaced the Queen's empty teacup with a fresh one, the steam curling gently upward before fading into the dim lamplight. Elizabeth barely glanced at it, her attention fixed instead on the parchment lying near the candle. She traced the edge of the wax seal, absent-mindedly, her thoughts elsewhere. Walsingham leaned slightly closer to speak in a tone too low for the council to hear. "We'll place 2 men at the south arch of the bridge, and another pair a priva. The hooded rider is no mere courier." The Queen's response was a whisper meant only for him. "I suspected as much. Follow him, but let him believe himself unseen." At the riverbank, the ferryman finished repairing his skiff and pushed it gently back into the water. The boat rocked once, then steadied, the ripples spreading outward in smooth, silent arcs. A child carrying a basket of rushes hurried along the quay, his bare feet splashing in shallow puddles, leaving behind a wavering trail of footprints on the damp boards. In the tower's chapel, the chaplain knelt once again beneath the flickering light of candles, their flames bending and straightening with each draft from the corridor. The raven shook the rain from its wings and hopped to a higher stone ledge on the tower wall, watching the barges drift by with an uncanny stillness. By late afternoon, the drizzle slowed, leaving the air heavy and damp, the city cloaked in a muted gray. Lanterns began to glow earlier than usual, their golden circles spreading softly across the wet stones. Elizabeth rose from her chair, the movement graceful and deliberate. "This night will not pass unnoticed," she said, her voice low, yet resolute. The council bowed their heads as she turned toward the window. The first thin crescent of moon was just visible between the clouds. The pale moonlight sifted through the drifting clouds, silvering the wet rooftops of London. Chimney smoke lingered low, merging with river mist until the outlines of distant buildings blurred. Elizabeth stood by the window, her fingers resting lightly on the sill, as though she could feel the pulse of the city beneath her touch. Walsingham joined her quietly. "The streets will be restless tonight," he murmured. She did not turn her head, but answered softly, "A restless city keeps its eyes open. That may yet serve us." Far below, the palace courtyard bustled with muted activity. A groom led the horses toward the stables, their hooves clicking gently on the damp stones. A lantern swung from the hand of a watchman, scattering droplets of rain as he passed beneath the archway. In the garden, the blackbird had found shelter beneath a stone bench, puffing its feathers against the lingering chill. At the river's edge, the hooded rider adjusted the leather strap of a satchel hidden beneath his cloak. He scanned the far bank with a slow, measured glance, then guided his horse closer to the water. The ferryman, noticing the figure, pretended to busy himself coiling a rope, though his eyes followed the rider's movements warily. On the tower's highest wall, the raven lifted its head toward the rising moon, letting out a single, low croak that echoed across the river. Inside the tower, the prisoner shifted at the sound, his gaze fixed on the narrow slice of sky visible through the bars. The chaplain approached him again. "You have the look of a man with words unspoken," he said, his voice no louder than a sigh. The prisoner gave a faint smile. "A man who keeps his words may yet keep his head." The chaplain inclined his head in silence and withdrew, the hem of his robe brushing softly against the damp stones. Meanwhile, in a narrow alley off the main thoroughfare, 2 of Walsingham's men huddled near a half-collapsed cart. They watched the street through the cracks in the boards, their breath forming faint clouds in the cool night air. A barge passed close beneath the bridge, its hull creaking against the current. From the deck, a muffled cough betrayed the presence of someone hidden under the tarpaulin. At the council chamber, Blanche was carefully packing away unused scrolls and maps, her movements precise and quiet, like a librarian tending to fragile volumes. Elizabeth, still gazing from the window, whispered almost to herself, "Every secret leaves a shadow, and every shadow has a watcher." The Queen's hound stirred from its resting place by the hearth, lifted its head briefly, then settled back into slumber as the fire popped gently in the grate. Walsingham's eyes followed the faint light of a distant lantern across the river. "The hooded man won't linger long. Our shadows are ready." The Queen nodded, her profile outlined against the silver glow of the moon. "Then let the night write its own testimony." A soft gust rattled the casement and carried in the faint scent of wet earth from the garden below. Down by the wharf, the hooded rider guided his horse onto a narrow plank laid across the mud and stopped beneath a bridge archway. The water lapped quietly at the pilings as though trying to overhear the secrets of the living. The ferryman stepped closer, pretending casual curiosity. "Strange night for a crossing," he said in a low tone. The rider replied with a curt nod, his face half hidden beneath the shadow of his cowl. Overhead, the bridge lantern swayed gently with the wind, casting long ripples of light across the black water. Inside the tower's chapel, the chaplain lit a fresh candle, the flame trembling, as if sensing the tension thickening in the city's breath. In the palace stables, a horse shifted in its stall, stamping once against the wooden floor, as if impatient for a call to ride. The night had settled in fully now, deep, damp, and edged with whispers. The river's current moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, carrying the faint scent of salt and wood smoke toward the wharf. Mist began to rise again from the water, curling around the pilings like pale fingers. The hooded rider leaned closer to the ferryman, his voice barely audible above the lap of the tide. "No witnesses," he muttered. The ferryman tilted his head, studying the man's shadowed face. "The river forgets everything by dawn," he replied softly, as though reciting an old proverb. Across the bank, two of Walsingham's agents watched from behind the silhouette of a moored barge. Their breaths steamed in the chill night air as they whispered short instructions to each other. One of them raised a hand for silence as the hooded rider shifted in his saddle, scanning the bridge above before dismounting. A distant bell told the 9th hour, its deep voice rolling across the city and stirring the pigeons from their roosts along the tower arches. Inside the palace, Elizabeth remained by the window, her eyes reflecting the moon's pale arc. She clasped her hands gently together as if in prayer, though her lips did not move. Blanche approached quietly, carrying a folded shawl. "Majesty, the damp air may chill you." Elizabeth accepted it with a faint nod, drawing the wool across her shoulders without looking away from the river. Walsingham returned from the shadows near the door. "My queen, the rider has stopped at the South Arch. I believe the meeting will begin within the hour." The queen's voice was low, almost serene. "Then the hour has chosen its witnesses. Let us see what truths walk upon that bridge tonight." In the tower's cell, the prisoner tilted his head as if hearing the distant toll of the bell. He closed his eyes briefly, lips forming a silent word no one else could hear. The chaplain, sensing the moment, whispered a short prayer beneath his breath, the candle beside him sputtering as a thin draft slipped in under the door. A dog barked somewhere far off along the embankment, its echo carried by the night wind. The raven shifted again on the tower's ledge, droplets of rain sliding down its black feathers as it observed the lanterns glowing on the bridge below. The ferryman's boat rocked gently against the current, the oar knocking softly against the hull as if impatient to be used. From the alley nearby, a boy carrying a clay jug of water stopped to watch the dark figure beneath the bridge, curiosity flickering in his wide eyes before his mother called him inside. In the council chamber, the last of the candles burned lower, its pool of melted wax forming a narrow channel toward the brass holder's edge. Blanche moved to snuff out the wicks, but paused when Elizabeth raised her hand in quiet refusal. "Let them burn," the queen murmured. "We will need their light before the night is done." A gust rattled the casement once more, bringing with it the distant scent of the river, mixed with the faint sweetness of rain-dampened earth. Down at the archway, the hooded rider drew a sealed parchment from within his cloak and tapped it lightly against the saddle, as if weighing a decision. The ferryman kept his gaze fixed on the water, but his ears followed every wordless movement. In the shadows beyond the bridge, a lantern flickered the sign Walsingham's agents had been waiting for. The faint lantern signal wavered once more, like a firefly caught in the wind, before it steadied. One of Walsingham's men tapped his companion on the shoulder, a silent command to stay alert. The hooded rider adjusted his stance, the hem of his cloak brushing the damp stone. A droplet from the bridge above slid down the arch and landed near his boot, rippling a tiny puddle that mirrored the moon. A soft cough came from the shadows, not loud, but enough to turn the rider's head slightly. The ferryman kept his expression neutral as he dipped an oar into the water and let it rest there, as though testing the current. From the far end of the bridge, footsteps approached slowly. The hollow, uneven rhythm of leather soles striking damp planks carried across the silence. A second figure emerged from the mist, carrying no lantern, relying only on moonlight and memory to guide his way. His cloak was lighter in color, but his hood was drawn low to conceal his face. Elizabeth, still at her window, noticed a subtle movement on the bridge. Her breath left a faint mist against the cold glass as she leaned forward slightly. Beside her, Walsingham stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back. "They've arrived," he said in a voice no louder than the whisper of the wind. Blanche moved to adjust one of the candles, the flame bowing low as if listening to the hushed voices outside. On the tower wall, the raven shifted again and gave a single quiet croak, its head turning sharply toward the approaching pair on the bridge. The prisoner in his cell stirred at the same moment, a strange intuition drawing his attention to the barred slit of a window that faced the river. The two figures beneath the arch came to a stop, their shadows merging in the pale pool of moonlight that spilled down between the bridge's timbers. The hooded rider broke the silence first. "The message," he said simply, extending his gloved hand. The newcomer hesitated, then produced a folded scrap of parchment, sealed with plain red wax. His fingers trembled slightly as he passed it over. "Too small for the Queen's hand," the ferryman muttered under his breath, though he made sure neither man could hear. One of Walsingham's agents, still hidden behind the moored barge, leaned forward carefully, trying to catch even a word of their exchange. But the river's quiet lapping masked the softer tones. From across the water came the faint clang of a bell, the sound of a barge signaling for the draw to lift. The hooded rider examined the seal briefly in the lantern glow, then tucked the parchment back into his cloak without breaking it. Above them, the bridge lantern flickered as a stronger gust of wind swept in, scattering tiny droplets of rain against the stone. The newcomer glanced up toward the arches, as if sensing unseen eyes in the darkness, then drew back his hood just enough to reveal a pale scar tracing his temple. Walsingham's gaze sharpened. "I know that face," he murmured to the Queen. Elizabeth tilted her head slightly. "Who is he?" "A man once thought loyal to our crown," Walsingham replied. "A soldier turned shadow, and, I fear, a traitor's courier." The Queen's fingers tightened around the shawl draped across her shoulders, but her voice remained calm. "Watch. Do not move too soon." The ferryman shifted his stance uneasily, sensing the weight of unspoken tension gathering beneath the bridge like the river's own dark tide. A barge passed again, its bow lantern casting a brief shimmer across the two figures' faces before disappearing into the misty distance. In the tower chapel, the chaplain lowered his head as if in silent prayer, though the whisper he spoke was only for himself. "May the truth find its way to the light before the night takes it." The raven ruffled its feathers and gave a low, throaty sound that faded into the wind. In the cell below, the prisoner let out a slow breath and whispered to no one, so the pieces began to move. The two figures beneath the bridge lingered in that uneasy silence, the damp wind tugging at their cloaks. The ferryman shifted his weight from one foot to the other, pretending to study the water but straining to catch their words. The hooded rider lowered his voice, a thread of sound just above the whisper of the tide. "If you were followed," the newcomer shook his head. "No one saw me leave the tavern. I slipped out before the watch changed." Moonlight glinted off the scar on his temple as he stepped half a pace closer, lowering his hood just enough for recognition. From their hidden post, Walsingham's agent stiffened at the sight, mouthing a silent curse to his partner. The rider's hand tightened on the edge of the parchment beneath his cloak. "The seal is fresh. It came straight from your master." Then, the scarred man gave a faint, humorless smile. "You asked too many questions for a messenger." Overhead, the bridge timbers creaked as the night wind swept downriver. Drops of rain fell from the joints like a slow, rhythmic ticking. Elizabeth and Walsingham watched from the palace window. The Queen's lips parted slightly as though to speak, but she caught herself, holding her breath instead. Beside her, Walsingham's fingers flexed once behind his back. A careless word could betray the whole exchange, he murmured. Blanche, sensing the mood, lowered her gaze to the floor and stayed still, as silent as the candle flames quivering in their sconces. On the riverbank, the ferryman shifted his grip on the oar. His instincts told him he was too close to danger, yet curiosity rooted him in place. The raven on the tower wall gave a single rasping call, breaking the night's hush for a heartbeat. The prisoner in his cell opened his eyes again at the sound. He rose slowly, crossed to the barred slit of the window, and tilted his head to listen. Beneath the arch, the scarred courier finally spoke again, his words a hiss just above the water's lap. "Tell your mistress the alliance will hold, but only if the letter reaches her unseen." The hooded rider nodded once, silent. The courier stepped back, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to materialize from the fog. On the bridge above, a lone cart rumbled by, its iron-bound wheels groaning on the damp planks. The sound masked the faint rustle of the rider securing the letter deeper into his cloak. In the alley nearby, Walsingham's agent took the opportunity to shift positions, pressing closer to the edge of the barge for a clearer view. The gust of wind that followed rattled the lantern on the bridge again, sending shadows dancing like dark birds across the stone walls. The ferryman cleared his throat softly, breaking the tension. "Shall I prepare the skiff for your crossing, sir?" he asked, feigning indifference. The rider gave a curt nod. "At once. We leave before the tide turns." The courier inclined his head but stayed where he was, watching as the ferryman unmoored the boat with practiced hands. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed at the scene unfolding below. "Do you think they part ways here, Francis?" she asked in a voice just above a whisper. "Likely so," Walsingham replied. "But we will follow both shadows. One might lead to the serpent's nest." The queen's shawl slipped slightly from her shoulder, and Blanche moved silently to fix it without a word. Across the river, the bell of a distant chapel chimed the 10th hour, its slow tolling spreading over the mist-covered water like ripples of sound. The raven turned one glossy eye toward the bridge and then back to the tower courtyard, shifting its talons on the cold stone. In the cell below, the prisoner chuckled softly, a dry, knowing sound. "Midnight games played before the hour strikes," he murmured. The chaplain heard the words but said nothing, merely adding another stick to the candle's flame to keep it alive through the chill. The hooded rider stepped onto the skiff as the ferryman steadied it. The courier raised his hood once more and faded back toward the bridge's center, already half lost in the drifting mist. The skiff rocked gently as the hooded rider stepped aboard, his boots leaving dark impressions on the damp wood. The ferryman pushed away from the stone steps with a slow, practiced stroke of the oar. The river accepted them with barely a ripple, the water smooth as ink beneath the pale arc of the moon. The lantern at the bow threw a trembling beam that glided across the current like a ribbon of molten gold. On the opposite bank, shadows shifted a pair of Walsingham's men, moving carefully along the quay, keeping just out of the light. Elizabeth watched from the palace window, her breath misting against the glass. "Like a ghost on black water," she murmured. Walsingham's eyes never left the small skiff. "A ghost carrying secrets, Majesty. Let us pray the river's silence is not deceived tonight." Blanche, behind them, folded her hands tightly before her, her gaze drifting to the soft flare of candlelight on the polished table. A breeze drifted up river, bringing the faint scent of tar and wet rope from the barges moored downstream. In the tower, the prisoner had returned to his bench but still sat upright, listening to the distant creak of the skiff's oars. His lips curved into a half-smile, as if he understood some private meaning in the rhythm of the strokes. The chaplain, seated a few paces away, watched him with quiet curiosity. Beneath the bridge, the courier lingered alone, one hand resting on the damp rail as he peered toward the retreating skiff. The ferryman shifted his weight and dipped the oar again, cutting a slow, even path across the moonlit river. Water slid against the hull with a gentle hiss. A heron lifted from the shallows and glided low over the surface, its pale wings briefly catching the lantern's glow before it vanished into the mist. On the wall above, the raven tilted its head as if following the skiff's journey with solemn interest. The rider remained silent, one hand holding the cloak closed against the night breeze, while the other stayed near the hidden parchment. The ferryman glanced up once, catching a glimpse of the man's shadowed expression before looking away again, keeping his thoughts to himself. Across the river, the two agents shifted position, slipping into a narrow alley to avoid a patrol of city watchmen. The guards passed, with halberds at rest, oblivious to the quiet pursuit that unfolded only a few paces away. Elizabeth stepped back from the window at last, her eyes thoughtful. He'll reach the far side before the tide grows stronger. Walsingham nodded. That is where we'll see the truth of his errand. In the tower courtyard, a guard stamped his feet to chase off the chill, his halberd clinking against the iron hinges of the gate. The prisoner whispered again to himself, this time too softly for the chaplain to catch the words. The ferryman guided the skiff toward the landing steps, the hollow thud of the whole meeting stone echoing faintly under the arch. The rider climbed out without a word, adjusted his cloak, and strode into the narrow lane beyond the quay. The ferryman lingered by the boat, watching the figure disappear into the fog before returning to coil his rope with slow, deliberate motions. At the far end of the bridge, the courier remained in the shadows, unmoving, a lone sentinel against the mist, as if waiting for an unseen signal before departing. A church bell rang the half-hour, its notes softer now, dulled by the dampness in the air. In the Queen's chamber, the last candle guttered as a draft slipped through the unlatched window, making the flame dance before it steadied again. The Queen closed her eyes briefly, resting her fingertips against the cool stone of the sill, as though drawing strength from the ancient walls themselves. Walsingham's voice broke the hush. The night deepens. We must be ready for what it brings before dawn. The fog along the river thickened as the hooded rider left the quay behind. The narrow lane ahead was slick with rain and glimmered faintly under the distant glow of a single lantern swinging in the breeze. His boots struck the cobbles in measured steps, careful not to echo too loudly between the damp brick walls. A stray dog nosed at a heap of straw by a shuttered doorway, then trotted silently into the mist as if unwilling to cross his path. High above, a shutter banged once, startled by the gust that curled around the corner of the alley. A few drops of rain still clung to the eaves and fell in tiny splashes at his feet. Two of Walsingham's men shadowed the rider from a distance. One kept to the deeper gloom of a recessed archway, while the other moved parallel along the opposite side of the street, always just outside the edge of lantern light. A distant bell tolled again, 11 strokes, this time sending its slow, sonorous chime rolling across the mist-draped rooftops. Inside the tower chapel, the chaplain whispered his evening prayer for the third time that night, the wavering candle casting a fragile halo around his bowed head. The prisoner shifted on his bench, leaning forward slightly as if listening to some secret carried on the bell's reverberations. In the Queen's chamber, Elizabeth stood unmoving by the window, her shawl drawn close, her gaze fixed on the faint shapes of barges rocking gently against their moorings. Walsingham had taken a chair near the hearth, but his eyes stayed on the shadows thrown across the floor by the dancing flames. Blanche moved softly to draw the heavy curtains, but hesitated at a subtle shake of the Queen's head. "Leave them," Elizabeth said in a voice scarcely louder than a breath. "The night still has eyes." Outside, the rider passed beneath the lantern and briefly revealed the damp sheen of his cloak. A narrow scrap of red wax showed where the parchment's seal pressed faintly against the fabric. He turned down a side street where the air smelled of wet timber and horse sweat, the clop of hooves from a distant cart muffled by the fog. On a balcony above the lane, a girl leaned out to shake crumbs from a wooden bowl for the birds that would come at dawn. She drew back quickly at the sight of the passing figure and closed the shutters with a muted thud. The two agents kept their distance. One signaled the other with a brief tilt of his chin toward a low archway ahead. Beyond that archway, the lane narrowed further, hemmed in by leaning warehouses whose upper stories nearly met above the rider's head. Rain dripped steadily from a broken gutter, pattering into a shallow puddle that mirrored the glint of his boots as he passed. The ferryman, having returned to his skiff, hummed a low tune as he wiped the oar, his song blending with the murmur of water against the hull. The raven, still on its stone perch at the tower, raised its wings slightly, as if sensing a shift in the air. The courier had at last left the bridge, his stride brisk as he disappeared into the opposite direction of the city streets. Elizabeth's eyes flicked briefly to Walsingham. Two paths diverged, she said softly, almost to herself. One we follow by river, the other by stone. In the chapel. The chaplain pinched out the spent candlewick and replaced it with a fresh one, the flame springing up anew, warm and steady. The rider finally stopped at the mouth of a small square, where a single oak tree grew from the cobbles, gnarled, ancient, its branches black against the milky sky. A lone lantern swung from one of its lower limbs, casting shadows that shifted like restless phantoms on the walls around the square. The rider paused there, scanning the darkened windows of the buildings that framed the square. The hooded rider lingered beneath the oak tree, his breath misting faintly in the chill air. The lantern hanging from the branch above swayed in the damp breeze, making the shadows of its twisted limbs crawl across the cobblestones. For a long moment, nothing stirred, only the soft hiss of drizzle returning as a fine, silvery rain. Then a door creaked open on the far side of the square. A sliver of warm light spilled briefly across the wet stones before vanishing as the door shut again. From that patch of darkness stepped a figure wrapped in a faded wool cloak, its hood drawn low but not enough to hide the outline of an older man's beard. The rider watched silently as the newcomer crossed the square, each step measured and soundless despite the slick ground. In the distance, the faint clink of a horse's bridle echoed as a cart was secured for the night. Then all went still again. One of Walsingham's agents crouched behind a rain barrel at the square's edge, barely daring to shift his weight as he tracked both men. His partner had taken position behind the warped shutters of an abandoned smithy, the scent of rust and damp charcoal thick in the air. Under the oak, the newcomer stopped, keeping a careful arm's length between them. "You're late," he said, voice soft but edged with impatience. "The river runs slow tonight," replied the hooded rider in the same low tone. The older man's gaze flicked briefly to the branch above, where the lantern flame shivered, as if in agreement. "You have it?" the man asked. The rider reached inside his cloak and withdrew the folded parchment, its red wax seal still intact, glinting in the lantern's tremble. "Good," the man murmured. He stretched out his hand but hesitated before touching it, as though aware of unseen eyes. In the Queen's chamber, Elizabeth turned from the window. Sensing a change in the air, though she could not see the square itself. "Something's happening," she whispered. Walsingham leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing. "The Oak Square," he said under his breath, as if naming the place aloud might draw its image nearer. The raven on the tower wall ruffled its wings once, scattering droplets of rain that slid down the stones to the courtyard below. In the chapel, the chaplain raised his head from prayer, pausing as the candle flame before him fluttered sharply, as though in response to an unseen breath. Back at the oak tree, the older man finally took the parchment, but held it close to the lantern's glow, turning it slowly between his fingers. "The seal's unbroken," he observed, his tone softer now. The rider said nothing, watching the man's every move. One of Walsingham's hidden agents shifted slightly, the creak of wet leather from his boot barely audible above the patter of rain. The older man's eyes narrowed at the faint noise, but he made no comment. Slipping the letter into the inner fold of his cloak, from a nearby alley, a stray cat padded out, shaking droplets from its fur before darting away under a broken cart. The lantern above them hissed as rain gathered on its rim and dripped onto the flame escard, sending up tiny puffs of steam. "Midnight approaches," the older man said quietly. "We should part ways before the streets wake again." The rider gave a single nod, then pulled his hood lower over his brow. At that moment, the church bell in the distance tolled the first stroke of 12, its heavy chime rolling over the city like distant thunder. Elizabeth heard it in her chamber and let her gaze drift toward the hearth, where the last log had burned down to a soft bed of glowing embers. Walsingham's expression tightened, as if the chime had confirmed a private suspicion. Under the oak, the two men exchanged a final wordless glance before stepping back into opposite directions. One toward the river, the other into the maze of streets leading deeper into the city's heart. The rain began to fall in steadier drops, spattering the square with dark circles that merged into glistening pools. High above, the raven gave another low croak and shifted further into the shelter of the tower wall's ledge. The older man, clutching the sealed parchment close to his chest, moved quickly through the narrow lane that led away from the oak square. The street lamps were few and far between here, and their weak halos of light barely pierced the damp fog curling up from the river. His boots made soft splashes in shallow puddles, the sound strangely loud in the midnight stillness. A stray dog barked once and fell silent, its eyes reflecting the flicker of a distant lantern before it trotted off behind a stack of firewood. Behind him, the rider melted into the mist, his dark cloak almost indistinguishable from the night. The sound of hooves soon faded, swallowed by the muffled drizzle. Above the rooftops, the moon briefly slipped free of the clouds, casting a pale silver light over the cobblestones and the moss-covered eaves of crooked timber houses. From a nearby tavern, long since closed for the night, came the faint scent of spilt ale and the soft rattle of shutters in the wind. Walsingham's agent from the smithy door had quietly followed the older man, keeping to the shadows where the buildings jutted out like broken teeth. His partner, from behind the rain barrel, signaled once with a quick tilt of his head before circling around to cut off the man's path ahead. At the palace, Elizabeth lingered by the dying hearth, her long fingers resting lightly on the carved arm of her chair. Her mind drifted back to a warning given earlier by an astrologer about the danger of letters traveling by moonlight. She shook the thought away, but the unease remained. Walsingham moved closer to the hearth's glow, speaking softly, almost as if to himself. Secrets have a way of finding their own road, even through the rain. Elizabeth turned her eyes toward him, seeking reassurance in his words, but finding instead the same silent vigilance she had come to rely on. Far below their chamber, the palace guards made their quiet rounds, boots clinking faintly against the wet stones of the courtyard. The soft hiss of the rain on their iron helmets sounded like the whisper of distant waves. In the chapel, the chaplain closed his book of hours, feeling a tremor in his fingertips, as if the weight of the night's secrets brushed against his prayers. Meanwhile, the older man quickened his pace as the lane curved toward a small, arched bridge spanning one of the narrower river canals. The wooden planks of the bridge creaked under his weight, water dripping from its railings to the sluggish current below. From beneath the bridge came the hollow splash of a barge pole, striking the side of a passing boat, followed by a low murmur of men guiding their craft upriver. The agent following him paused at the bridge's entrance, crouching behind a stack of empty barrels. His breath came out in small, misty clouds as he waited for a signal from his partner. On the opposite bank, the other agent appeared like a shadow among shadows, raising two fingers in the air before fading back behind the corner of a leaning warehouse. The older man crossed the bridge and disappeared into a street lined with tall, narrow houses whose upper stories leaned toward one another as though sharing whispered conspiracies. In one of those houses, a candle still burned behind a warped glass window. A woman's silhouette passed briefly in front of it, carrying a basin of water, toward a table before she drew the curtains closed. The smell of damp wool and river mud clung to the air as the man stepped carefully over a broken paving stone and turned left into an even narrower passageway. The wind shifted, carrying with it the briny tang of the Thames and the faint tolling of another bell. Softer, further away, as if carried across water. Back at the palace, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to sit, leaning slightly forward so the glow of the embers painted her face in warm light. "Will the letter reach us?" she asked softly. Walsingham's eyes stayed fixed on the dancing ember sparks. "It will reach someone, Majesty. The question is, whom it chooses." The raven on the tower wall gave a single slow blink, its feathers ruffled by a gust that rippled across the river. The older man's cloak caught on a splintered doorframe as he slipped into the alley. He tugged it free with a soft rasp of fabric, careful not to break stride. The narrow way smelled of wet hay and old fish crates stacked along the walls. Above, the sky was a quilt of cloud, moonlight leaking through in scattered silver seams. Raindrops beaded on the crooked iron hinges of shuttered shop windows, catching glints of that light like tiny stars. A rat scurried along the gutter, splashing through a thin runnel of water trickling toward the river. Its brief squeak echoed strangely in the confined space before fading into the hush of dripping eaves. The man slowed for a moment, pressing himself into a recessed doorway to listen. The night held its breath, only the faint hum of the river beyond, and the quiet crackle of rain against wooden beams. He moved on, unaware that one of Walsingham's agents had shadowed him to the alley mouth. Crouching behind a pile of damp sacks, the agent's hand rested lightly on the pommel of a short sword, though he had no wish to draw it, unless forced. On the far side of the alley, another figure detached itself from the dark wall, the partner, now circling to block the escape toward the river stairs. The older man reached a half-rotted wooden gate at the end of the lane. He pushed it open slowly, its hinges sighing in protest. Beyond lay a narrow courtyard, half-flooded with rainwater, an abandoned cart leaning on its side near a stack of firewood. A candle glimmered faintly in a small upper-floor window overlooking the courtyard. The curtain fluttered, then stilled, as if someone had been watching. The man crossed the courtyard in 3 quick strides and entered a low-roofed warehouse through a side door left ajar. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wet hemp rope and tar. From the shadowed rafters came the slow drip of water seeping through the tiles, each drop landing with a hollow plink on the planks below. The agents followed, pausing at the doorway to exchange a silent nod before stepping in after him. Back at the palace, the queen rose again and returned to the window. Through the misty panes, she could see the reflection of her own face, pale and thoughtful, beneath the golden circlet resting on her hair. She whispered as if to the reflection, "What words ride the night to reach me?" Walsingham, hearing her but not answering, moved toward the writing desk and laid a fresh sheet of parchment before him, dipping his quill into the dark ink. His expression was unreadable, eyes lowered to the page, though he had yet to write. At the tower, the raven shifted its talons against a slick stone, tilting its head as though listening to distant footsteps it could sense but not see. Inside the warehouse, the older man paused beneath the dripping beams, drawing the letter once more from his cloak. He held it up to the faint moonlight, filtering through a cracked shutter, the wax seal glistening like a dark ruby. From behind a stack of wooden crates, the first agent stepped forward, the soft leather soles of his boots barely stirring the dust. "Evening's grown late for messages, friend," the agent said quietly. The man turned sharply, his hand instinctively closing over the letter as if to shield it. Before he could reply, the second agent emerged from the shadows opposite, blocking the way back to the door. "Sir Walsingham would rather like a word," the second added in a tone as calm as the first. The older man's eyes shifted between them, measuring his chances. The silence in the warehouse deepened, broken only by the distant creak of the river's tide against the pilings. Outside, the rain eased into a fine mist, the kind that softens the edges of every shape it touches. Far away, in the palace chapel, the chaplain reopened his prayer book as the candle beside him flickered lower, a tiny bead of wax sliding down to pool on the brass holder. The older man's breath came slow and measured as he straightened his back beneath the sagging rafters. The letter crinkled faintly in his grip, as if it too was tense under the gaze of the 2 agents. One of them, the taller, with the hood thrown back, took a step forward, the floorboard beneath his boot letting out a tired groan. "No harm meant," he said, his tone low, almost coaxing. "The spymaster only wishes to know your errand tonight. Best we speak calmly." The man's eyes glinted in the slant of moonlight that sneaked past the shutter. "My errand belongs to the queen herself," he answered, voice steady but with an edge of wariness. The shorter agent shifted his stance near the door, hand still resting lightly on his sword hilt. "Then you've nothing to fear. But the hour is late, and letters that walk in darkness often stir dangerous questions." From the roof above came a slow drip of rainwater falling into an old iron bucket. Plink, plink, the sound soft and hypnotic in the silence that followed. In the palace, Elizabeth sat once more, her fingers tracing absent circles along the carved pattern of the armrest. "Walsingham," she murmured, It feels as though a chord has been struck somewhere in the city, and we are waiting for the echo to reach us." Walsingham finally set his quill to the parchment. But the words he wrote were only a date and a name, a note to remember the night as unfolding events. The raven on the tower wall shook its feathers, scattering a fine spray of droplets that glittered briefly in a thread of moonlight before falling into the dark courtyard below. In the warehouse, the older man shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward the window as if expecting something to appear there. "I am no enemy to your master," he said. "I carry no treachery. But the road between a queen and her servant grows long when watched by many eyes." The taller agent lowered his hand, letting it fall loosely to his side. "Then show us the seal," he said gently. "Let us see whose crest binds your parchment." The man hesitated, then stepped into a sliver of light, raising the folded letter just high enough for the wax seal to catch the pale glow. The imprint of the royal rose shimmered faintly beneath the droplets clinging to it. Both agents exchanged a brief glance. The taller one inclined his head slightly, no longer so tense. "Then it truly rides for her," he said. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, whistling softly through the gaps in the warped wood as though sighing with relief. Somewhere beyond the warehouse walls, the river lapped gently against the piers. The waters hushed like the slow breathing of the sleeping city. The second agent stepped aside, opening the way toward the door. "You'll go with us," he said, the tone more courteous than commanding. "We'll see the letter delivered safely under Sir Walsingham's eye. A stormy night is no place for solitary errands." The older man gave a faint nod, his grip on the letter loosening just a little, as though he'd been carrying not only parchment, but the weight of its secrecy. From the river came the low call of a boatman adjusting his ropes, the sound echoing against the stone embankment before fading into the mist. At that moment, far off, the chapel bell chimed the quarter hour, a softer, more subdued sound than the heavy toll of midnight. As though trying not to disturb the sleeping streets, Elizabeth lifted her head at the distant chime, sensing the night's story continuing unseen. The warehouse door creaked as it swung open again, letting in the damp night air, heavy with the scent of riverweed and rain-soaked timber. The older man stepped out first, flanked by the two agents, who moved with quiet precision, their boots making almost no sound on the slick cobblestones. The drizzle had slowed to a mist, draping the alley in a silver haze that blurred edges and softened the harsh lines of shuttered windows. The moon floated pale above the rooftops, trailing a faint halo as it shone through the thinning clouds. In the distance, a lone watchman's lantern bobbed as he made his rounds on the main street, its warm glow winking in and out behind narrow lanes. From an upper window, the muffled cry of a baby reached them briefly, then faded as someone soothed the child back to sleep. The taller agent led the way across the small bridge they had crossed earlier, the planks beneath them damp and glistening. The river below lapped lazily at the stone embankment, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and tar from moored barges. The older man glanced once over his shoulder at the dark outline of the warehouse receding behind them, then pulled his cloak tighter against the breeze. "Will she read it tonight?" he asked quietly. The shorter agent, walking just behind him, replied in a low voice, "If it carries weight enough to ride through rain at this hour, Sir Walsingham will place it in her hands before the embers die." The group turned down a narrow lane, lined with leaning timber-framed houses whose upper stories seemed to bend toward each other like gossiping neighbors. A cat leaped from a low wall into the shadows of a porch, eyes glinting once before vanishing. Inside the palace, the queen stood near the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hearth behind her. She touched the cool glass with her fingertips, as though trying to feel the distant streets beyond. Walsingham set aside his quill and reached for his cloak, sensing the approaching footfalls in the city's hush. "Your letter nears majesty," he said in a tone that was both reassurance and quiet warning. The raven shifted on its tower perch, head tilting at some far-off rustle, then settled again with wings folded tight against its sides. The three men in the street slowed as they reached the palace gate, where two guards in damp steel helms stood watch beneath a torch whose flame hissed and guttered in the breeze. One guard stepped forward, lowering his halberd slightly in greeting when he recognized the agents. "Late travelers," The guard murmured. "On the Queen's business," the taller agent replied, showing the signet ring on his gloved hand. The gate creaked open, the heavy iron bars glistening with beads of water. They entered the courtyard, the stone underfoot still dark and slick from the evening rain. A horse in the nearby stable snorted softly as they passed, shifting its weight and stirring the scent of straw and wet leather into the cool air. From an upper gallery, the faint yellow glow of a lantern moved along the balustrade as a servant made his nightly rounds. The drizzle eased further until only a fine mist hung in the air, turning the torchlight halos into soft golden orbs. Inside, the Queen drew her shawl a little closer, the flicker of the hearth reflecting in her eyes. "Let them come quickly," she whispered, not to Walsingham, but to the night itself. The palace corridor was hushed, except for the muted tap of boots on polished stone as the three travelers approached. The tall agent stepped forward first, bowing to the guard stationed outside the Queen's private chamber. A servant in a plain linen tunic opened the heavy oak door without a word, the hinges sighing softly as if relieved to let the night's burden pass. Warm light from the hearth spilled into the hallway, carrying with it the scent of burning oak and beeswax candles. Elizabeth turned from the window as they entered. Her face, framed by the soft fall of her dark velvet shawl, seemed calmer now, though her eyes searched the older man's hand where the sealed parchment rested. Walsingham moved closer, his cloak shedding a few drops of lingering mist onto the floor. He offered a small bow to the Queen and extended a gloved hand toward the courier. The older man stepped forward and, without a word, placed the letter into Walsingham's grasp. The wax seal, the deep red of a rose after rain, gleamed faintly in the firelight. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the gentle crackle of the hearth, the distant drip of rain sliding from the roof into the courtyard below, and the muffled coo of a pigeon settling on the ledge outside. Elizabeth accepted the letter from Walsingham's hands. Her fingers traced a raised impression of her own crest, as if confirming its presence by touch before breaking the seal. The parchment unfolded with a soft rustle. The lemon juice ink was faint at first, ghostly pale lines that slowly darkened in the warmth of the fire nearby. She read in silence, the flickering light painting shifting shadows across her thoughtful features. As her eyes moved over the hidden words, a faint breath of relief left her lips. "It is no threat," she said quietly at last, "a warning of the weather upon the seas, and of a delayed fleet. Nothing more." The older man lowered his shoulders slightly, as if a great weight had slipped away. Walsingham gave a slow nod, his usual sharp gaze softening for the briefest of moments. "Then tonight carries no dagger in the dark, only tidings of storms and safe harbors." Elizabeth folded the letter again and set it on the small carved table beside her chair. "Let it be answered at dawn," she said, her voice hushed but steady. "For now, let the city rest." The taller agent stepped back into the shadow of the wall, bowing his head respectfully. The shorter one loosened the tie of his cloak, finally allowing himself an easy breath. Outside, the drizzle ceased altogether. The moon, pale and round, drifted clear of the clouds, scattering silver light over the damp courtyard stones. In the tower, the raven settled its wings and tucked its beak beneath them, drifting into a quiet stillness. The Queen turned toward the hearth again, lowering herself into her chair. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest as her gaze softened on the flames that now burned low and calm, their glow steady and warm. A hush spread through the chamber, the sort that comes when a long-held tension ebbs away, leaving only the soft symphony of night. The ticking of cooling timbers, the occasional sigh of wind, and the slow heartbeat of the river beyond the palace walls. Elizabeth's eyelids grew heavy as the warmth of the room wrapped around her like a gentle cloak. Walsingham lingered a moment longer by the door, then stepped silently out, leaving the Queen with her thoughts and the fading crackle of embers. As the last candle guttered lower, its wick curled and stilled. The air in the room held a peaceful stillness, as if even the walls were ready for sleep. And somewhere in the city beyond, the quiet lanes, the empty bridge, and the oak square all rested under the moon as silver watch, their secrets folded into the night, their whispers eased into silence.